Coming up on Bloomberg this morning, no deal.
They have chosen not to accept our terms.
A day of intense peace talks between the U.S. and Iran ends without an agreement. What it means for the ceasefire and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz.
And the Manhattan District Attorney is launching an investigation into California Congressman Eric Swalwell after a former staffer accused him of having sex with her without consent.
These allegations of sexual assault are flat false.
This morning, pressure grows for him to drop out of the race for governor.
Plus, training for the Paris Marathon with ChatGPT.
I wanted to try something that I couldn't do.
A Bloomberg senior editor is running his race right now. Hear all about his AI-assisted regimen. Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, coming at you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. I'm Christina Ruffini.
And I'm Tim Stenivek in for David Gura. It is Sunday, April 12th. Welcome to our viewers and listeners across all our platforms, Bloomberg TV, Bloomberg Radio, and across the Bloomberg app.
And we are also, of course, here with Lisa Mateo, and we've got a lot to get to this morning, so let's go straight to the headlines. Lisa?
Let's get right to it. Well, the absence of a deal putting a fragile two-week ceasefire at risk. Now, as for the responses to negotiations, Vice President J.D. Vance, he claimed Iran declined to commit to not pursuing a nuclear weapon. Iran's semi-official media, it cited excessive U.S. demands. The foreign ministry said it was natural that differences wouldn't be resolved in a single round of talks. And Pakistan, well, they said the talks were, quote, constructive and called on both sides to maintain the ceasefire. Bitcoin dropped right after news of the deal. It's now down nearly 2.5%. Oil and gas markets likely to see a jolt tomorrow morning. And in one of the first signs of the breakdown in talks affecting Hormuz, Bloomberg reporting that two empty supertankers, they made a last-minute U-turn as they tried to sail through the Strait. This was just as negotiations failed. It's not clear why they turned back. It comes after the U.S. Central Command said two U.S. Navy ships transited the Strait and operated in the Arabian Gulf. It's the first steps toward clearing the mines that the U.S. says Iran planted in the waterway. Now, meanwhile, Israel continues to strike towns in southern Lebanon, and Bloomberg reporting rocket fire from Lebanon continued to target Israel's northern communities, triggering sirens and sending residents to shelters. The Israel Defense Forces says it struck a rocket launcher in southern Lebanon, positioned and ready to launch toward Israel. And in other news, it was a hero's welcome for the four-person Artemis crew after splashing down in the Pacific Ocean Friday night. Their historic 10-day journey around the moon was a test flight that will lay the groundwork for future missions. NASA astronaut Christina Cook described what she saw from space.
So when we saw Tiny Earth, people asked our crew what impressions we had. And honestly, what struck me wasn't necessarily just Earth, it was all the blackness around it. Earth was just this lifeboat hanging undisturbingly in the universe.
Great description. NASA astronaut Reed Wiseman, he said the crew is bonded forever. And Rory McIlroy, he entered yesterday's round of the Masters with a lead nobody has ever seen before. Well, he now enters the final round, sharing the lead alongside Cameron Young at 11 under par. The first tee time, Christina and Tim, it's just after 9 a.m. local time. And McIlroy, he tees off at around 2:30 this afternoon.
Okay, we can look forward to that.
I do want to say that is clearly the superior Christina. You guys know I've been obsessed with that astronaut.
Christina Cook, the astronaut.
Christina Cook is just...
There's still time.
So cool. I was looking people, I mean, look, we had a lot of serious news today, and that was such a, you were saying yesterday, it was such a light, and it was such a, like, a lovely story. But it was also, people online are calling it competency core, because it was just a warm blanket of people being really good at their jobs.
Well, I feel like also at a time where there's so many divisions, not just here in the U.S., but around the world, this is something like you can look at the entire Earth from space and be like, we are all there together.
You literally get some perspective.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa. We appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Lisa.
All right. We want to turn now to the news at hand.
Yeah. Just hours ago, Vice President J.D. Vance left Pakistan after a lengthy series of peace talks lasting more than 15 hours. No deal was reached, though. Here's what the vice president had to say about those discussions.
We have been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms. Questions?
Sir, Nick Robertson from CNN. Precisely what have they rejected here? Can you help us understand it a little bit?
Well, I won't go into all the details because I don't want to negotiate in public after we negotiated for 21 hours in private. But the simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. That is the core goal of the President of the United States, and that's what we've tried to achieve through these negotiations. Again, their nuclear program, such as it is, the enrichment facilities that they had before, they've been destroyed. But the simple question is, do we see a fundamental commitment of will for the Iranians not to develop a nuclear weapon, not just now, not just 2 years from now, but for the long term? We haven't seen that yet. We hope that we will. Jen.
Was there a framework on anything? And also, did the Iranian frozen assets come up? And did you reach any conclusions on those frozen assets?
We talked about all those issues, Jen, and we talked about a number of issues beyond that. And so certainly those things came up. But again, we just could not get to a situation where the Iranians were willing to accept our terms. I think that we were quite flexible. We were quite accommodating. The president told us, you need to come here in good faith and make your best effort to get a deal. We did that. And unfortunately, we weren't able to make any headway. Preston.
Mr. Vice President, how often did you communicate with President Trump throughout the negotiations? There are reports that there were multiple rounds, where there were breaks in between negotiations. How often did you communicate with the president throughout those rounds, and what was he saying as you were going through these negotiations that you said fell short?
Yeah, obviously we were talking to the president consistently. I don't know how many times we talked to him, a half dozen times, a dozen times over the past 21 hours. We obviously also talked to Admiral Cooper, to Pete, to Marco, to the entire national security team. We talked to Scott Bessent a number of times. So look, we were constantly in communication with the team because we were negotiating in good faith. And we leave here with a very simple proposal, a method of understanding that is our final and best offer. We'll see if the Iranians accept it. Thank you.
All right, it was a short press conference, but there's a lot to unpack there. To help us do that, we want to go to our man at the State Department, currently in Islamabad, Bloomberg reporter Eric Martin, and also joining us from Dubai is our Horizons Mideast and Africa anchor, Germano Brisecci. Eric, I want to start with you because we heard Vice President Vance say 21 hours multiple times. But we were on the air and we were going back and forth with you guys yesterday, and those negotiations didn't even start until late in the afternoon yesterday. And then can you clarify it for us? I was saying this morning, it's not like we are here sitting at a table talking back and forth for those 21 hours. Can you describe to us what was actually happening, who was moderating, the structure of these, if there was structure, and what we know about what went on?
Sure. So I'm coming to you from Islamabad in front of the Faisal Mosque. And yesterday, it's really been an exhausting past 24 hours. We saw the vice president's arrival yesterday about 10:30 a.m. local time. When he talks about 21 hours, it appears that he's counting the time from when Air Force 2 touched down to when it took off just after 7 a.m. again this morning. What we saw was a meeting with the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Shehbaz Sharif, that began about 2 p.m. yesterday, and then trilateral discussions with Pakistan and with Iran and officials from those governments starting at about 5 p.m. And we were there, following this all night, waiting to see what news would come out of this. Nobody knew what to expect. Hour after hour ticking by, and us wondering, is this going to spill into next week? Is this going to be something that the full day Sunday that this takes? Very little information coming out last night in the overnight, and we were all pulling an all-nighter, just awaiting. Shortly after 6 a.m., this press conference that you just showed, and of course, failing to get Iran to agree to the terms of the U.S. demands, but perhaps unfair expectations in a certain way, a 6-week war, and a 47-year revolution in Iran since 1979. To believe that all of this was going to be resolved in 21 hours is a lot of weight to put on the shoulders of the negotiators. So obviously that didn't materialize, and here we are leaving President Trump with options about how to proceed.
Well, let's go to the region now and bring in Jumana Berceci of Bloomberg Horizons, Middle East and Africa, joining us in Dubai. Jumana, I want to talk to you about where things then go in the Middle East and what happens as we do get close to at least the beginning the second week of this fragile truce. What does it mean for military action before potentially the next round of talks?
Yeah, I will say over here in the region, there was a lot more cautiousness going into this weekend's discussions for the reasons that our colleague was just describing. It was a really tall order to be able to bridge the daylight between the two sides over a series of a one-day discussion, whether it's 21 hours or so forth. I mean, at the end of the day, they were marathon discussions, but it was going to be a very tall order to be able to reach a conclusive negotiation settlement that would be sufficiently satisfactory for both sides. And so looking ahead, I think there are a couple of questions that we have short term. Number one, is the ceasefire still going to hold? And we've got about 10 days left of that ceasefire. It all comes down to President Trump and what he wants to do from here, because he's got a couple of options. Either they go down the track of continuing along the lines of diplomacy. Pakistan obviously are pushing for that angle. But then the other option, of course, is once again to intensify things militarily, to once again push Iran to the point where the U.S. feel like they have more leverage over them, and Iran will come to the table in perhaps a more supplicant manner. Now, again, we don't know what the U.S. president is thinking at this point, but what I will say from the perspective of Gulf countries, they are on board with the demands that the U.S. have been listing, whether it's limiting Iran's ballistic weapon capabilities, whether it's restricting their ability to go on to develop a nuclear weapon, and of course the important one that time and time again has come up from many voices in the region is it is an unacceptable outcome for Iran to maintain sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. That is just not a non-starter. And so the point that we're at right now, I think, still raises a lot of questions as to whether the ceasefire is going to be honored, whether we're going to get a few more days of diplomacy. I think that is the hope, but there's also the expectation that things could downward spiral once again.
Eric, I also did not hear the vice president mention the Strait in those remarks, which seemed really interesting to me, especially since the last thing we heard from the president yesterday was, the Strait will kind of open itself. Do you think the U.S. is moving more and more towards a reality where they may go back to negotiating with Iran mostly on nuclear things and leaving the security of the Strait to regional allies like Jumana was just talking about and other people to deal with?
Well, it's been an action-packed past month. I remember just a few weeks ago being on the tarmac with Secretary of State Rubio, leaving the G7 meeting in France and talking about the U.S. objectives regarding the missiles, missile launchers, missile production, Iranian support for proxies, the nuclear program, and talking about all of those U.S. military objectives being in a certain way separate from the Strait, from the administration's point of view, where the administration sees the Strait as something that would require an international coalition supportive of the Bahrain resolution at the UN Security Council last week to call on countries to use force to open the Strait. And so you're right. We didn't hear the Strait mentioned in his remarks and in his summary today. But I think that's something that, we need to see what President Trump is going to opt for and what course he's going to take going forward. It's obviously been a very news-packed week. Just 1 week ago, we woke up to the president on Truth Social threatening Iran with really bellicose language.
We were live on air for that.
And Tuesday and the ceasefire announcement.
Sorry, I forgot there was a delay. Yeah, we were live on air for that and trying desperately to read that tweet in an acceptable way for television. Go ahead, Eric.
Yes, and so just how much has happened in the past week is really kind of breathtaking when you think about it in terms of how fast things have moved. And so we need to say, as my colleague was just saying there, to play out. We saw Lebanon pulled back. Actually, on Saturday, announced that the leader of Lebanon is not going to go to Washington for State Department organized negotiations for a ceasefire in that war this coming week. That's something that Israel was also going to go, and that Iranian regime has made clear they want to see Israel stop its attacks and a ceasefire in Lebanon. So a lot still to happen here potentially in roughly these 9 days left of the ceasefire announced on Tuesday.
Jumana, I also want to ask what you've been hearing from sources in the region, because I know some folks I was talking to, I was saying the usual players you would see, and people who have an interest in this outcome, I was saying, are you sending delegations? Are you trying to get involved in this? And a couple regional diplomats told me, absolutely not, because even though expectations were high from the U.S. side and the global side, a lot of experienced diplomats in the region said they did not think this was going to work and they didn't want to be anywhere near it when it fell apart. So were you hearing that as well? And now what? What are the next steps for GCC countries, for Gulf allies to try to negotiate something maybe on their own?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've spoken about this before, Christina, and the fact that the Gulf states don't speak as one, right? So
of course,
each one of them has been putting out their own statements and has been approaching this like rather differently. If you look at the comments coming through from, say, senior UAE officials, I will say that they have become a lot more strident in the last couple of days. Their patience is running increasingly thin with what Iran is doing with the Strait. Saudi Arabia has seemed to be a bit more amenable when it comes to diplomacy. The foreign minister actually received a call from Abbas Arakchi a couple of days ago. That's not to say that they too also are more accepting of the situation that we find ourselves in. Absolutely not. But I think from their perspective, perhaps there is a little bit more hope of getting involved in those diplomatic discussions. There was some talk also that Saudi Arabia were somehow indirectly were going to be involved in those discussions in Pakistan as well.
Right.
But ultimately, look, the priority here is to, number one, make sure that they don't have an increasingly combative neighbor on their doorstep. I think the likes of Qatar have said this quite openly, and that in years to come, Iran geographically will still be a neighbor to the Gulf region, and therefore they have to bear that in mind. And the very worst case scenario is having a defiant and angry and combative neighbor on your doorstep. And then the second point to what I was saying earlier, the matter of the Strait, and pretty much every single one of those Gulf officials has said that if the U.S. gives up leverage, even if they propose a system where there's some joint control or tolling, that is still an unacceptable outcome because it sets a precedent. Yeah. That would be a very dangerous precedent for all maritime crossings around the world. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to have to leave it there, guys. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Jumana Bercetchi, host of Horizons Middle East and Africa, joining us from Dubai, and is in Islamabad, Pakistan.
And Eric Martin.
Eric Martin, Bloomberg News reporter, joining us as well.
All right, coming up, voting is underway as President Viktor Orban faces the most serious electoral challenge to his power in 16 years. Bloomberg's Oliver Crook is going to join us live from Budapest for the update on that consequential election. That is straight ahead on Bloomberg this weekend.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. Well, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office is opening an investigation into Representative Eric Swalwell of California. They're looking into a claim that Swalwell, who is running for governor, assaulted a woman in New York City in 2024. Swalwell is a Democrat who has been a leading contender in the race to replace Governor Gavin Newsom. The news comes after the San Francisco Chronicle and CNN, well, they both reported on women who said that they were victims of the congressman. Swalwell denied the allegations in a post on social media.
Of sexual assault are flat false. They're absolutely false. They did not happen. They have never happened. And I will fight them with everything that I have.
Swalwell has not ended his campaign, but many prominent supporters are no longer backing his bid for governor. Well, in other news, a federal judge has been instructed to reconsider the possible national security concerns of halting construction of President Donald Trump's $400 million White House ballroom. An appeals court panel, it says that it didn't have enough information to decide how much of the project can be suspended without jeopardizing the safety of the president, his family, or the White House staff. And Rory McIlroy's 6-shot lead has evaporated. He now enters the final round, sharing the top spot of the leaderboard alongside Cameron Young at 11 under par. Christina and Tim, Young, 28 years old. He has 3 kids, all under 5, and he travels with them on the road. He takes them with him. He's got a lot on his plate.
Wow.
That is a lot.
All right. Speaking of people who have a lot on their plate, that is people running for president. There's a couple elections going on today. We're going to start with Hungary. It is election day there, and President Viktor Orban is facing a serious electoral challenge as voters take to the polls to decide whether he should continue his 16-year run in office.
Yeah, the results of this election could reshape Europe as his opponent, Peter Magyar, wants to strengthen the country's relationship with the European Union. Bloomberg News Chief Europe correspondent Oliver Crook joins us now from Budapest. Oliver, we saw you yesterday, just about 24 hours ago, as we were heading into today. Just give us an update on the ground, what the setup looks like, what turnout looks like at this point.
Yeah, so the polls have been open for a few hours now. We're about halfway through the voting day. They'll close at 7 p.m. and starting at about 8 p.m., we're going to start to get an idea of what this vote actually looks like. Obviously, everybody here in Hungary has been tense with anticipation in terms of the outcome here. Will it end the longest-running European political dynasty within the European Union, Viktor Orban's premiership here in Hungary? And that is the big question. If you look at the polls leading into this, as we've been discussing, there are many of them showing a double-digit lead for the opposition candidate, Peter Magyar. That being said, every single person I've spoken to, whether it's the experts, whether it's the man on the street, nobody wants to make a prediction of how this is going to go by this evening, a little bit later today. There have already been allegations on both sides of false flag operations, of irregularities within voting. If the election is very close, there is still 10% of the vote that comes from outside of the country. That will take another week to calculate. This could be kicked into different courts if it's close in different districts. Those courts obviously favor Viktor Orban. So these are some of the many issues that we're watching here and observing here on election day as we watch down the sort of the river here, all of the sort of different parties collecting their headquarters for their celebrations or concessions this evening. And there's also a question of whether, if Viktor Orban loses, he will in fact concede.
Oliver, this is sounding all very familiar to those of us who covered the last U.S. election. That's like the equivalent of the mail-in ballot. I didn't realize that was such a big 10% is a big percent of the vote. I was also reading that one of the reasons people may be interested in Magyar is something we saw when Biden was elected here, it's been a long weekend, was elected here, that Hungarians are looking for kind of a calmer, less combative government. They don't want to be at the center of these political fights anymore. They want to just kind of have, I remember when people here were voting, they said they wanted the cool jazz backgroundness of a presidency. Are Hungarians craving a little calmer political climate? Is that what's driving some of this?
Yeah, I think to a degree they are. I mean, the sort of whole Orban theory of politics has been basically to create sort of external threats, either, sincere or in some ways fabricated, to the Hungarian population. There's been a lot made of the bureaucrats in Brussels. A lot of the election posters were sort of evil-looking images of Ursula von der Leyen. There's also the issue, of other sort of influences within the country, the sort of woke liberal side of things. That has, again, been very much the Orban playbook for the last 16 years, creating a lot of fear from outside and saying that Fidesz, his party, is the only one that can defend it. That being said, there is a sense that has sort of run out of steam at this point, and Peter Magyar has put out a slightly more optimistic view about what the future could look like. His slogan has been now or never, basically, which is suggesting in some people's minds this is the time to pivot back to the European Union, away from Moscow. All of that being said, I mean, he is coming in as a sort of with this ambition of being a sort of reformer of the system. There's also lack of patience here for the graft and corruption that they've seen from the Orban regime, the enriching of his family and friends. But that being said, Peter Magyar is still a very nationalistic figure. This is a person that is squarely on the right, really draped in the Hungarian flag. Even before J.D. Vance arrived here, he said basically, once again, something we've heard throughout the election campaign, this is an election that will not be decided in Washington, D.C. It will not be decided in Moscow, but it will also not be decided in Brussels. So he's really been taking some of the Orban playbook, but trying to give a more optimistic sort of view of the future.
You mentioned J.D. Vance, so that's where I want to go, and American involvement and American allegiance with Viktor Orban right now and from President Trump. It's an interesting position for J.D. Vance to be in, having gone to Hungary, then going right to Pakistan, and then on his way back from Pakistan without resolving this war, and sort of the implications of what that means for the vice president, especially as the American administration has taken such a pro-Orban position. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, when we think about how sort of Trump has cast himself on the global stage, for the Europeans and for the far right in Europe, it's really been a rallying cry. Certainly at the beginning of the Trump administration, you saw the far right over in Germany, the far right in France, the United Kingdom, here in Hungary, all line up behind the President of the United States as sort of a consolidated message of an effective political strategy that A, gets you elected, but sort of works in terms of policy, does get the agenda moving forward. Within the last 6 months, what we've seen from the President of the United States on the issue of Greenland, on the issue of Iran, which has caused huge sort of issues here in Europe in terms of energy prices causing inflation. That is something that has zero support in Europe from the liberal side of the spectrum all the way to the conservative side of the spectrum. So there's that side in which, you know, the sort of sway of the Trump administration feels that it is sort of diminishing as the flag bearer for far right politics within Europe. There's also the other question for sort of J.D. Vance and for the Trump administration. They're not only a flag bearer for the far right, they're supposed to be the great negotiators, breaking through these sort of impossible geopolitical issues. We saw that happen with Gaza and Israel. That is obviously not happening here with Iran. So J.D. Vance, he comes to Hungary, he endorses Orban, he then goes to Pakistan, fails to get a breakthrough there. Yeah. If you get a failure here from Orban getting reelected, it poses some real questions about the effectiveness of those two reputational qualities of the Trump administration.
Oliver, I also want to ask you, because it's not just America that has kind of inserted itself into this election. There's other players as well, including the EU, Russia, and China. I remember when I was covering Pompeo during the first Trump administration, he did a huge swing through Hungary, through Slovenia, through Eastern Europe, trying to get Chinese influence out of that region. Where does that stand, and how much have you seen Russia and China, and to some extent the EU, try to put their thumb on the scale here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the EU obviously has a massive interest in what happens in Hungary because Hungary is part of the political structure of the EU. Viktor Orban sits at the European Council. He currently is the only person sitting between Ukraine, the EU, and that 90 billion euro loan that's supposed to go to Ukraine. Yeah. When I spoke to Zelensky a few months ago, he said that that is a question of survival for the country. Russia obviously is well invested. That's well cataloged here in Hungary. But the question of China is a super interesting one. You go back to 2023, when you look at the Chinese investment that was made in the continent of Europe, 44% of that investment was in Hungary, a nation of 10 million people, about a €250 billion economy, very, very small, because BYD, the EV manufacturer, they opened up operations here. CATL was another one that was operating here. And when Xi Jinping came to Europe, which you know is a very rare event indeed, he came to France, he came to Serbia, and he came to Budapest. So again, this has been part of the sort of Orban playbook of sort of playing between everybody. Not clear if it's going to go continue to go forward in that manner, but Peter Magyar may also want to continue to draw for that. He's a big generator of jobs and manufacturing output to have those two massive Chinese companies operating here in Hungary.
And Huawei, right? When I was there in Ukraine, everybody had a Huawei phone, which was really surprising me. Tim, you have a consumer question. You're just saying.
Yeah, well, I'm just wondering how the war is playing into the backdrop of this election and higher prices across Europe and perhaps higher prices across Hungary and what that's doing to the consumer in Hungary and sort of how the different candidates are actually addressing that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted to ask you which war, because both wars are playing pretty large roles here in Hungary.
Fair
for
enough.
The war in Ukraine, this has basically been the poster child for Orban. I mean, you see Zelensky plastered across this town as a sort of mugshot in a sort of warning, don't get embroiled with Ukraine, we need to be sort of more hedged. That's been part of the Orban message. But in terms of the energy question, it's a serious one for Hungary. It's a landlocked nation, doesn't have access to seaborne crude or LNG and those sorts of things. And it's a nation that has been severely scarred by the inflation crisis over the last couple of years. I mean, I think inflation in Hungary reached over 20%, much higher than it was the average across from the European Union. So that has really stayed with people in terms of some of the concerns. And as energy prices get boosted, you can insulate to a certain point, but at a certain point, that's going to be felt by the consumer. And we should say that a lot of the domestic issues that Viktor Orban was having on the economy are going to be Peter Magyar's issues, and they're not going to be swift and easy ones to resolve.
Oliver Crook, thank you so much. I could talk about this all day because I'm a giant nerd on this, but I think we have to move on to one of our other elections that's happening. Thanks so much, and we know you'll stay on it for us. It's so funny that you ask about consumers, because every election that I've ever covered, it's always about the economy. It's always about how people are feeling. I remember when I covered Zelensky's election, one of the reasons he got elected is because people were annoyed by the potholes and the price of food. I mean, there are things that are common no matter where you go.
Look, it's no matter what it is, and it's the kitchen table issues. And that's 100%. Why, at least here in the United States, mayors are often like, we don't actually have political parties. We're here to deal with the potholes and those kitchen table issues. But at the end of the day, it's about cost. We as Americans can identify with that, and the way that was front and center in the 2024 election and will be front and center in the midterms. And it's even in more stark relief in Europe, where energy prices are that much higher and that much more affected by the war in Iran and by Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
And Ukraine has really affected the economies over there. All right, so we're going to turn to
another
what's
election?
happening in another election right now.
Well, voters in Peru are also headed to the polls for what's expected to be the first of 2 rounds of their presidential election in a record-breaking presidential election. Of the 36 candidates for president, okay, get this. One is a fugitive, running for office from an unknown location. Another, Christina, died after the ballots were printed.
If you notice, we have 3 graphics. Our control room has to hit that 3 times just to show all of the different candidates. The election comes after a failed attempt to streamline the nation's process. So voters are dealing with small print and ballots that are apparently the size of a family-sized pizza box.
Do you remember the 2000 presidential election?
Are you going to say hanging chads?
I'm going to say hanging chads and butterfly ballots. And, you thought it was a challenging, if you were in Florida at that time, right, it was challenging to find who to vote for between 2 candidates. What about, 3 dozen candidates?
I can't imagine.
Fonts?
I mean, we were talking in the newsroom earlier this week about whether we thought this country should have more parties, but when you have more parties, it can get a very cluttered ballot.
I guess the argument of if we look at this as, from sort of a pro-democracy angle, it's that everybody
I am pro-democracy,
does have a chance to run for the highest office in the land, and they can get there.
I mean, we've been speaking a lot about Europe, right, and these parliamentary, more pluralistic governments. Coalition governments can be really hard to move forward. And that's the thing, is obviously the bigger the tent, the harder it is to manage. And so although these governments can be more inclusive and they tend to be more moderate, they also tend to be slower and more bureaucratic. And that's the criticism that people like Orban and President Trump and others have leveled towards the EU and these big bureaucracies.
But the other side of that is that it does hold those in positions of power to account.
Of course.
And there could be quick referenda.
100%. All right, coming up, Wall Street banks kick off earnings seasons tomorrow. What does that mean for the markets? That is coming up on Bloomberg this weekend, just ahead. You can watch, stream, or listen to us on your radio. We'll be right back.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. Well, the National Action Network convention in New York City came to a close yesterday with a number of speakers sharing the stage with Reverend Al Sharpton. Democratic Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona, he spoke about President Donald Trump's handling of the war in Iran.
What Donald Trump taught the Iranians is they now have a strategic asset that they can exploit for decades to our detriment. And then the other thing he accomplished, other than closing the Strait of Hormuz, is he alienated our allies.
In other news, golf in the spotlight. Rory McIlroy, he entered yesterday's round of the Masters with a lead nobody has ever seen before. He now enters the final round sharing the lead. That's alongside Cameron Young at 11 under par. The first tee time just after 9 a.m. local time in Augusta. McIlroy, he tees off around 2:30. And the WNBA may have their first $1 million player. ESPN reporting Jackie Young is nearing a 1-year deal with the Las Vegas Aces at the regular max of $1.19 million. Now, the 4-time All-Star guard, she was expected to be a free agent this offseason, but she didn't end up taking any meetings with other teams. The Aces guys are actually the defending WNBA champions, so good for her.
That's very cool. I like that, Lisa. That's
$1
great
million,
news.
finally.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I don't want everyone to freak out because Herman Chan is on our set right now. I don't want them to freak out.
Do you want to tell people who's on the set, and then I will explain to you what you said at break?
So Herman Chan, we're going to talk banks, and Herman Chan is here. And whenever people see Herman Chan, they're like, is there a regional bank melting down? Because
that's what I was like, do I need to be concerned?
Silicon
because I
Valley
haven't met
Bank,
Herman yet, but is there like a
First
dark
Republic
cloud
Bank,
around
whenever
him?
he walks into the studio, it's like...
It's very cheerful.
Okay, well...
you have to be stoic to be the Grim Reaper.
I love this. Well, we are talking banks because Wall Street's biggest banks are set to report earnings next week, starting with Goldman Sachs on Monday. It has been actually a tough quarter for the 6 giants so far. The KB Bank Index had its weakest quarterly performance since 2023. Strong earnings could spark a rally next week. We are joined by Bloomberg News senior U.S. bank analyst Herman Chan. Christina Kino is also here. She's managing editor for Bloomberg Markets Live blog. Herman now covers the big banks as well as one of the team leaders for Bloomberg Intelligence. So Herman, I do want to start with you. And you know, when we talk about the banks, we often talk about, okay, what moves the company's stock? You know, what are what is trading revenue going to look like? I'm not interested in that right now.
Sure.
I'm interested in what consumers are telling the banks that they're doing in a higher energy prices environment, in a higher inflation environment. These are the companies that see what we're spending our money on at that exact moment. What are they going to tell us?
Right. So they're going to tell you that they're spending more on gas prices at the pump over the past month or so. So that's going to be front and center when they talk about the consumers. I think you're also going to hear about a resilient economy, because we're still seeing a lot of GDP growth still chugging along. But there is going to be the question, are the higher energy prices going to create some cracks in the consumer side?
Well, I think the challenge between this conversation that we're having now versus what the conversation that we had about this in 2022, the last time we saw inflation like this, was consumers still had that cushion post-pandemic.
That's right.
That's not still there.
Right. So the savings rates are much lower than they were, and you don't have the sort of stimulus that was propping up the consumer back then. So there are some questions on where things are going to go going forward. But we'll hear more about that over the next few weeks, because that's going to be front and center for earnings across the board.
And Christina, we want to talk to you about the markets at large and kind of what I've been calling this indefatigable, possibly delusional optimism we keep seeing. But before we do that, I want to talk to you about crypto, because we saw Bitcoin and others fell 2% last night after this negotiation in Islamabad fell apart. And my question for Tim, and he said it was actually a good question, I should ask it of the table, this morning was, I thought crypto was supposed to be more insulated from being reactive like this. I thought it wasn't supposed to be this fluctuate. Like, what's going on there? Why are we seeing such a reaction from cryptocurrencies?
I mean, when you see a catalyst as big and broad-ranging as the war in Iran, it really just throw away all of your preconceived notions about what is a haven and what is not a haven in this market. I mean, ultimately, crypto is still probably considered a riskier asset than all the traditional assets that we have out there. And so when something as acute of a risk aversion event hits as the war, then really the first port of call that people see to sell would be riskier assets such as crypto. And I think, remember, it's had such a massive rally over the past year, and then issues started coming through even before the war started. And so I think now that you got this geopolitical catalyst, that kind of just piles on the pressure, and that's what we're seeing at the moment.
Are you seeing sectors that are still holding up as havens? Where are people still investing with this uncertainty, or is it just all over the place?
I mean, the price action over the past couple of weeks, it's been very interesting. Even energy, for instance, hasn't been insulated, because while higher oil prices, in theory, good for energy companies, I think now, because of that potential hit to consumers, they are also starting to feel that bite in that demand side of the equation. And then, I think things obviously like consumer stocks have been very much at the forefront of getting hit. I think, things like big tech is still acting actually as a relative haven within the equity space, just because these are big companies with a lot of cash. And during times of turmoil, such as what we are in now, investors do tend to flock to companies that are unlikely to go bust anytime soon.
You brought up the volatility that we've seen. A good segue to go back to Herman on what that does for the banks and the way that traders navigate this volatility and how that could be a boon for the bottom line. What do we expect this week?
That's right. So we are expecting a big jump in trading revenues, both on the equities and fixed income side. You mentioned volatility. That's actually a helper for the month of March, given all of the uncertainty in the markets, especially in areas like rates trading and businesses that were affected by the uncertainty. So banks like JP Morgan, Bank of America that have more FICC revenues should bode well for them for the first quarter.
And Christina, just to kind of bridge our guests here, how important are bank earnings to markets, and where do you see that really reflected the most?
Extremely important, Christina. I mean, we're going to be watching it very closely as well. I think, very much the steer for the rest of the market is, how much has this volatility kind of created opportunities for banks, but also the consumer response, as Tim was alluding to, because that is going to be a very important signal moving forward. I think at the moment, investors are kind of, they've digested the lay of the land at the moment, right? Higher oil prices weighing on everything else. Now we're waiting for that second order consumer hit and what that's going to do to consumption and just consumers' ability to spend their money, if they have any money left, moving forward. That's going to move a lot of market sentiment from here on out.
So, Christina, if we play out Christina's question regarding Bitcoin, the one thing we can watch is JD Vance comes back to the United States after, I'm not going to say failed negotiations, but the war's not over at this point.
Unsuccessful.
At this point, I think
Yes.
that's fair to say.
100%. They didn't. We didn't reach a deal. That's
Okay.
how markets are treating it. Yeah.
Well, so how do markets treat it? How does oil look tonight? How do risk assets look tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, I think the balance tilts back toward that sort of risk-off reaction, right? I think a lot of what we've seen in markets has been very much a function of oil prices. And we have seen oil prices pulling back below $100 a barrel last week. So at minimum, that's probably going to be the first order reaction, higher oil prices to start the trading week. And that's going to just drive the rest of market sentiment. Stocks have been negatively correlated with oil, so meaning higher oil prices probably going to mean weaker stocks to start the week at the very least.
We've only got about 30 seconds, but I do want to ask you about this Jamie Dimon letter to shareholders on Monday, where he kind of urged America to get back to basics and calmer politics.
Right.
Those two streams, they usually try not to cross them, but is it
Right.
getting to a point where they've got to say something because it's impacting the bottom line?
Jamie's sort of a spokesperson for the banking industry, and
Like, shove him out front, Jamie, go say the thing.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the letter was very wide-ranging. Mentioned geopolitics, mentioned the war, mentioned also the American dream, and also the importance of creating a very strong military for the United States as a whole. So it's something that he does do a lot of prognosticating on, and the industry is better for it.
All right, Herman Chan, Christina Kino, thank you both so much. Please come back.
I will say we just scratched the surface with these two. Check out the Markets Live blog for all of Christina and her team's work. And then Herman has some great notes on the Bloomberg terminal, especially when it comes to AI and how these banks are using AI.
All right.
It's required reading as we go into.
Well, Christine was already on my list, but I will add Herman.
Add everybody that you see.
There's so many
on the
great
show
people here, guys. I'm
to the
trying.
list.
All right, coming up, speaking of great people, a Bloomberg senior editor is about 10 miles into the Paris Marathon right now after using AI to train. We're tracking you, Derek Wallbank. Up next, our conversation with Derek about how his training went.
Also, explore live streaming news, interviews, all on our Bloomberg TV shows, documentaries, reporters, and more. Check it out, bloomberg.com/videos.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Week, and I'm Lisa Mateo alongside Christina Ruffini. Tim Senevic also joining us this morning. So AI, it's used for a lot of things, right? Maybe a personal trainer. I've kind of thought about it. Maybe, Christina.
I have too, and I'm so anti-AI, but this is the one place I would use it. And Bloomberg senior economics and government editor Derek Wallbank is making a pretty strong case that I should, because he ran that very experiment, to help him run today's Paris Marathon. He's actually running it right now. Our control room says he's around the 10-mile mark. We believe in you, Eric. You can do this. Derek wrote about his journey in the weekend essay at Bloomberg.com, and we talked to him just before the race. Derek, thank you so much for joining us. Are you a marathon person? Have you done marathons before?
I'm so not this person. I don't think anyway. No, I tried a marathon like more than 10 years ago, and it was a complete disaster. Oh, no. I mean, really complete disaster. I think a lot of runners sometimes will say that, oh, this didn't go well, and you look at the time and it's like, oh my goodness. No, this was genuinely a complete disaster. It was the Marine Corps Marathon in Washington. I went to a podiatrist afterwards because I had so many problems, and they were like, congratulations on your only ever marathon you're ever going to do. This is dumb. You're never going to do this. So this is not me. But I sort of decided, look, you know, I wanted to try something that I couldn't do, right? And I wanted to sort of get myself in a fitness shape that I wasn't in and that I couldn't get into. And I was like, okay, if I'm going to do this, I need to make some changes. What could I do? And I was like, I know what I'm going to do. I'll go get a trainer. Better yet, let me just build one myself.
And you did. That's exactly what you did. I totally get where you are. I did the New York Marathon, tore my meniscus, and I swear I would never do another one again. So you're a better person than me. But you have like apps like Strava, Runna, right? You have human coaches, but you decided on ChatGPT, okay? So why did you decide to go that route with this?
Well, look, so I'm living now in San Francisco, right? It's the world capital of artificial intelligence. And every single time that you talk to somebody, I've discovered the number one question is, what are you doing? What are you building? You know, what are you trying to develop? And so there's this sort of spirit in the city that like anything is possible and that AI can kind of do a lot. So I guess there's a little bit of like optimism in the water. That all things are kind of possible. This is like San Francisco, I would say, is like all things positive on AI, where a lot of other places are like very much all things negative. And so there's a little bit of that optimism that I was trying to do, but there was also this curiosity, right? Which is basically, what could I do with it? It seemed like it would be a really smart way for me to be able to figure out what AI can do, maybe what it cannot do, and you know, use myself as my own guinea pig. I'm always happy to sort of do that.
I have not run a marathon. I don't want to run a marathon. I want to run a marathon. I keep waiting. I turned 40 this year and I thought maybe it'll kick in and I'll have a midlife crisis and what? Nope. But as someone who's tried this once before, I'm assuming you trained a little bit before. What was the training regimen? What was different? What did ChatGPT and our AI overlords tell you to do?
Yeah, so it was really interesting. So I spent about an hour feeding this beast that I was building, basically all of the training that I had done for everything before, all of my 5K runs, my 10K runs, you know, the soccer I was doing, the tennis I was playing, all of that. I fed it all of that, and it came out with a plan for me of sort of going out about 5 or 6 days a week of doing something. But it was a lot more structured. But what I found that was really different, it was a lot more responsive. It was a lot more personalized. I could go back and say, hey, look, here's how I'm feeling. Here's what I was thinking. And it would make adjustments for me. Wow. And that was something I'd never really seen before. You know, if something went wrong, it was able to be a lot more responsive than before. I actually, in the process of doing this article, I talked to some people who were developing AI-based fitness apps on the very vanguard of this technology. They said that's actually something they're hoping to be able to build in future editions. So that's actually something, it's not really out there, but that was something really cool. On the downside, though, AI does have its limitations. You know, at some point, my AI system started hallucinating. It has a limit on how much stuff you can tell it before it doesn't really know what's important and what's not important. So, you know, it's not necessarily an easy cure-all. This got very difficult to be able to manage as we were going through.
All right, Derek, are you going to go when you do your next marathon, because you know you're gonna, or maybe your Ironman or whatever?
No.
Are you going for the app, the human, or the Chat GPT? Which are you going?
If you had to do this again, yeah.
I'm going for a mix of humans and technology for sure. You know, you try and figure out how to get out, how to be moving, how to be positive and going forward. And any way you do that is good. But technology alone is not going to get you there. It can help, though, and I do think that this increase in AI technology is going to maybe make some of this a little bit more accessible to the general public than it has been before, because it's certainly, if nothing else, it's a lot cheaper than some of the other options that may be on the table right now.
Tim, have you done a marathon?
I've not done a marathon. My wife just did the New York Marathon.
Good for her. Oh, good.
Yeah,
that's
amazing.
amazing.
But like you, she didn't tear a meniscus after, but like you, she was.
Oh, it was like one and done.
She's like, I'm done. Yeah,
yes,
hurting.
That's it. All right, Derek told us his race began at 11:32 a.m. Paris time. He's about 2.5 hours in right now. Hopefully he can beat his previous PR of 7 hours.
All right, we're watching you. We are coming up on 8 a.m. in New York. Still many more headlines ahead.
The next hour starts right now.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend from our global headquarters here in New York. It is just about 8 a.m. here in New York. I'm Christina Ruffini.
And I'm Tim Stenovec in for David Gura. The big story right now, J.D. Vance on his way back from Pakistan. This after unsuccessful negotiations that did not end the U.S.-Israeli war with Iran.
That's right. No deal. Hours of negotiations. Our team says it was about 15 hours. The vice president seems to be counting 21 hours from the moment his plane touched down. I don't think we need to make a big deal about it. But it was basically one day to try to get this done, and it seems like it didn't happen.
But I think expectations were that you can't solve this within one day. I mean,
those were my expectations.
Were
but
they?
Yes.
Yeah,
But you can't, because the last time these negotiations happened, even with this administration, they've been days and days and weeks. So this was a really tall order. And remember, they didn't start on the same page. So.
And look, that is the backdrop for our coverage over the next couple of hours. And we got a great program of people joining us around the world who are going to help answer some of these questions.
But first, we're going to start with Lisa Mateo, who, of course, is here with the headlines.
You got it. And now that fragile ceasefire is at risk. That's after U.S. and Iran, they failed to reach a deal in peace talks. Vice President J.D. Vance, he made the announcement in Pakistan.
And I think that's bad news for Iran, much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could. And they have chosen not to accept our terms.
Well, Vance said Iran declined to commit to not pursuing a nuclear weapon. Bitcoin, it dropped right after news of the no deal. It's now down more than 2%. Oil and gas markets likely to see a jolt tomorrow morning. And in one of the first signs of the breakdown in talks affecting Hormuz, Bloomberg reporting that 2 empty supertankers made a last-minute U-turn as they tried to sail through the Strait, just as negotiations failed. It's not clear why they turned back. Now, this comes after U.S. Central Command said 2 U.S. Navy ships transited the Strait and operated in the Arabian Gulf. It's the first steps toward clearing the mines that the U.S. says Iran planted in that waterway. Now, meanwhile, Israel continues to strike towns in southern Lebanon, and Bloomberg reporting rocket fire from Lebanon continued to target Israel's northern communities, triggering sirens sending residents to shelters. The Israel Defense Forces says it struck a rocket launcher in southern Lebanon, positioned ready to launch toward Israel. And in other news, it was a hero's welcome for the 4-person Artemis crew after splashing down the Pacific Ocean Friday night. Their historic 10-day journey around the moon. It was a test flight that will lay the groundwork for future missions. NASA astronaut Victor Glover got emotional.
When this started on April 3rd, I wanted to thank God in public, and I want to thank God again, because even bigger than my challenge trying to describe what we went through, the gratitude of seeing what we saw, doing what we did, and being with who I was with, it's too big to just be in one body.
Oh, he's fighting back tears. And also NASA astronaut Reese Weissman, he said that the crew is bonded forever. Well, Rory McIlroy, he entered yesterday's round of the Masters with a lead nobody has ever had before. Well, he now enters the final round today. He's sharing the lead alongside Cameron Young at 11 under par. The first tee time, Christina and Tim, is just under an hour from now. McIlroy, though, he tees off later this afternoon around 2:30.
All right.
Golfy golf. Look, I think we could all solve every world problem if we all went to space together.
I'm fine with that. That would be fine. I mean,
seems like it. You keep playing these.
I threatened to shoot people in
and
space.
They get so
they
emotional.
are just completely changed
it
after
does.
they see that.
It does. Like, it brings tears to your eyes. And I was like, okay, puts in perspective for a lot of things.
Some nice.
Hold it together, Steph.
I'm trying.
That's what we got to do.
I know. I was getting a little teary earlier, and I was like, wow, we can't have that on television. All
Well,
right.
back to our top story, because as Lisa mentioned, Vice President J.D. Vance has left Pakistan. No deal in hand after more than 15 hours of negotiations. When speaking to reporters after talks, the vice president said the U.S. made its needs clear to Iran in order to reach a peace deal.
We need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. That is the core goal of the President of the United States, and that's what we've tried to achieve through these negotiations. Again, their nuclear program, such as it is, the enrichment facilities that they had before, they've been destroyed. But the simple question is, do we see a fundamental commitment of will for the Iranians not to develop a nuclear weapon, not just now, not just 2 years from now, but for the long term?
All right, back with us from Islamabad, our man at the State Department, Bloomberg's Eric Martin, is joining us from Pakistan, where those talks took place. We also have Bloomberg White House correspondent and frequent friend of the show, my friend Jeff Mason. And joining us here on set, we have senior journalist for Israel's Channel 13, Neria Kraus. Thank you so much for coming in. We're going to start overseas with Eric, because Eric, I know you heard that soundbite from the vice president. Probably it's your third or fourth time this morning hearing it. But the thing that strikes me about America's position, and what you just heard from the vice president, is he said we wanted to make clear our terms, and those terms are that Iran cannot pursue a nuclear weapon. Iran says, trust or not, we have no aspirations of a nuclear weapon. This is a peaceful nuclear program. That's always been their position. It's obviously there's problems with it. What stands out to me is that was the state of play before these talks and even before this conflict. So what changed? And why didn't this talk that the U.S. was trying to have before this war?
That's a great question, Christina. I mean, this is something that we've seen in terms of the past 6 weeks of this war, these long-standing demands of the U.S. You talked about the fact, and Tim talked about the fact, that perhaps it was unreasonable to believe that in 21 hours of negotiating here in Islamabad, we were going to see an agreement to end this war. Diplomacy takes time. That's something that when you talk to people who have spent their careers at the State Department or in foreign policy, at the White House, National Security Council, these kind of deals take time to develop and to craft. The JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Agreement during the Biden administration, that was a 2-year painstaking negotiation, and these negotiations typically involve a kind of a give and take. Each side has to make some concessions to get to an agreement. And so when you look at the demands from the Trump administration, it's not apparent, at least not publicly apparent, what they are conceding to Iran as part of these negotiations. And they are really maximalist demands from the Trump administration that have not changed significantly since Geneva and the last round of talks in February, before President Trump decided, along with Israel, to strike Tehran. So that is a big question, is, in terms of this there's this idea of ripeness theory, that you get peace agreements when both sides are exhausted and are ready to make peace. It's not clear that either side, or at least that the Iranian side, is ready to make peace here. And of course, the Strait of Hormuz, they've demonstrated an ability in recent weeks to control it, to impact global markets, and to affect a great degree of pain on the U.S. and on Western Europe. And so the question is, will they continue to use that leverage going forward?
Yeah, that's a very good question. As Eric just reminds everybody, there's a lot of distance between these two sides when it comes to what each one is looking for. Jeff, I want to bring you in from Washington and get the Washington perspective. When you joined our show on the weekday, Bloomberg Business Week Daily, you mentioned that success in Pakistan would look like just the fact that these two parties even got together. Maybe you had the most realistic view of what a successful weekend or a successful day looked like. Do you stand by that? Was this a success because the U.S. and Iran spoke?
Well, it's not my job now to determine whether it was successful or not. What I think I said, you're right, is that the fact that they were getting together was seen as a success by both sides, but the stakes were high in terms of coming away with something. And Vice President Vance returning to Washington now without anything to deliver in terms of a successful deal. And also, I think notably, not a willingness, or at least a verbal declaration that they're going to continue high-level talks is certainly a blow. And I think what it raises for me in terms of questions next is, what does President Trump now decide to do? He had created himself a little bit of an off-ramp here with the 2-week extension from his threats to bomb civilian infrastructure. and basically just put it all on the vice president to come home with some kind of an agreement after talks this weekend. Now he doesn't have that. So does he come back and say, all right, we're gonna re-up those threats? Or does he say, okay, we don't need a deal, which, by the way, he has said repeatedly, while then couching it with other threats? Or does he decide to go back to a military campaign?
Neria, I want to turn to you because one of the big outliers was Israel was not at these talks. There's also the Israeli front in Lebanon, which the U.S. said wasn't a part of the talks, and then Iran and Pakistan said should be part of the talks, and they kind of asked Israel to tone it down a bit. But you've spoken to President Trump recently on the phone. President Trump was in Florida with Marco Rubio at a UFC game. Just talk to us about where the White House is and where the relationship between the Prime Minister and the President is at this time.
So I think Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, they're very much cooperating on this entire situation. But after the ceasefire, Prime Minister Netanyahu did not want to do a ceasefire with Lebanon.
Right, he said it was a separate issue.
Yeah, he said it was a separate issue and a separate, I would say, skirmish. This is the term that he used. And then President Trump speaks with him last week, and he tells him, you need to low-key. And President Trump tells me that on a phone call, and then not a long while after my phone call with President Trump, my interview with President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu obeys, and he says, I'm going to start negotiating with Lebanon. But he does not end that, again, skirmish. He continues with the blows, but he goes low-key. I mean, he's not doing that in Beirut. It's more like going on southern Lebanon. And we should say Hezbollah keeps on launching rockets at Israel. Israelis are in the shelters in the past 3 days, even after the ceasefire with Iran. And this is a part of the talks in Pakistan, because President Trump says, I want those talks in Pakistan or the talks with Iran to be successful. This is why I need Israel to low-key, to finish that thing with Lebanon, even for the short term, so that I can continue and have a successful deal with Iran. And this is why it's so important for President Trump.
So, Eric, I want to bring you back in here after what Neria said about what Israel is doing, because I guess my question is what it means for negotiators and how they're going to resolve this. Is anyone still in Pakistan? Are there delegations from the U.S. still there? Folks who have been on the ground or will be on the ground trying to hash this out? Or is everybody completely going back to their own countries?
Tim, at this point, our understanding is that everybody, all of the high-level negotiators from the U.S. have left for Washington. We saw reports that they had a refueling stop not long ago at Ramstein base in Germany, and that confirmation that Vice President Vance, as well as Special Envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, have all left Pakistan. But this is an important point as to what Jeff was just mentioning, which is that President Trump has said he doesn't need an agreement here. But at the same time, Iran has shown an ability to cause this pain for the American economy. And President Trump needs to respond to constituencies, to voters. He's in the election in November, and he has to be responsive to those constituencies in a way that certainly the regime in Tehran, repressing, killing tens of thousands of protesters, is not responsive to its citizenry and to its constituency. And so that's a challenge for a political challenge for President Trump, is the domestic political dynamic, the impact of this war, and those kinds of considerations. So that's something that suggests a lot of analysts I've been talking to have been saying that they don't think that if this peace negotiation that we've seen begin in Pakistan this weekend, if this fails, that they're necessarily going to just automatically go back to the military option. There are political considerations here as far as how he goes forward, the promises by both President Trump and Vice President Vance to avoid the kind of forever wars that they criticized from their predecessors. And so there's that political pressure to not necessarily go back to exactly the place that we were 1 week ago.
Jeff, I also want to ask you, the other thing that was missing from any of the vice presidents, I think he took like 3 questions. It was a pretty short press conference.
We played almost the whole thing.
Literally, yes.
Yeah.
He didn't mention the Strait, which seems like a big deal. And we've got some sound of the president talking about it on Friday that I want you to listen to really quick.
The Strait will open up. If we just left, the Strait's going to, otherwise they make no money. So the Strait's going to open. But what we have is no nuclear weapon, but we'll open the Strait anyway. Don't forget, we don't use the Strait. Other countries use the Strait. So we do have other countries coming up, and they'll help out, but we don't use it. It won't be easy. It won't be. I would say this: we will have that open fairly soon.
Jeff, give me your read on the fact that the president was not at these negotiations, was at a UFC fight, and seems to just be saying he's moved on from the Strait. The Strait will handle itself. I think that regional allies would probably dispute that. Do you think the president is trying to move on from this? And is there a worst case scenario for Europeans and some of our Asian allies that the U.S. could leave without resolving the Strait, and it could be in an even worse situation than it was before this conflict started?
Absolutely. I think that scenario is highly possible, but I don't think it's only worst case for Europe. I think it's also got major economic and political ramifications for the United States, despite the fact that the president plays down or likes to emphasize that the U.S. doesn't use that waterway for a lot of its energy needs. The U.S. is connected to the global economy. And if the rest of the economy and the rest of the world is affected by it, then it's going to have ramifications here too. And those ramifications turn political if the gasoline prices in this country stay high. So the president has been giving mixed messages about the Strait of Hormuz, just like he's been giving mixed messages about the war generally, about whether he needs a deal or whether he doesn't, about whether he's going to strike again or whether he's not. And that's just how Donald J. Trump operates. It makes it difficult to figure out if you're an analyst or if you're a reporter or if you're the market. And I think those are the questions that we'll have to try to get answers to in the coming days. But I don't think it's as simple as he's trying to make it in that quote. In fact, I think one of the biggest pieces of political damage to him could end up being people concluding that things are actually worse for the United States as a result of this war, both in terms of the Strait of Hormuz and in terms of the lack of visibility on Iran's nuclear program going forward.
Neria, just 20 seconds. The appetite for Israelis for a conflict such as this to continue. What is it after being mired in conflict for almost 3 years?
Israelis want this issue to end. They want the Iranian nuclear weapon to be resolved. And you know, my first phone call interview with President Trump after the war has started, he told me no other leader could have done that. And I think that's true. History proves that. And now he has the mission to try and solve this, maybe forever, potentially forever. But the Iranians are lying in the negotiating rooms. And this is why Witkoff, Kushner, and J.D. Vance were not, I would say, pleased with the way they acted in the negotiating room. And this is why they had to wrap it all up and say, we're leaving a draft here, and we're not going to continue negotiating face-to-face. You have to give us a full answer, and then we're going to try and see where it goes. And I feel like President Trump wants it solved. I think that he's hands-on.
All right, Neria Kraus from Israel Channel 13. Of course, we had our own Eric Martin joining us from Islamabad, and the one and only Jeff Mason chiming in from Washington. Coming up, 2 empty supertankers making their way through the Strait of Hormuz turned around after peace negotiations. We'll talk about what that means for energy markets straight ahead on Bloomberg this weekend.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office, they are opening an investigation into Representative Eric Swalwell of California. So they're looking to claim that Swalwell, who is running for governor, assaulted a woman in New York City back in 2024. Swalwell is a Democrat who has been leading contender in the race to replace Governor Gavin Newsom. And the news comes after the San Francisco Chronicle and CNN both reported on women who said they were victims. Swalwell denied the allegations in a social media post, but also said this.
I do not suggest to you in any way that I'm perfect or that I'm a saint. I have certainly made mistakes in judgment in my past, but those mistakes are between me and my wife. And to her, I apologize deeply for putting her in this position.
Now, Swalwell has not ended his campaign, but many prominent supporters are no longer backing his bid for governor. And in other news, a federal judge has been instructed to reconsider the possible national security concerns of halting construction of President Donald Trump's $400 million White House ballroom. Now, an appeals court panel, it says that it didn't have enough information to decide how much of the project can be suspended without jeopardizing the safety of the president, his family, or the White House staff. And Rory McIlroy's 6-shot lead has evaporated. He now enters the final round, sharing the top spot of the leaderboard alongside Cameron Young at 11 under par. Now, it's the countdown to tee time, guys. Just starts in under an hour from now. McIlroy, though, he's kicking off things later this afternoon, around 2:30 this afternoon.
You getting out on the course today?
I don't know.
No,
I'm not a golf person. I don't golf. Mini golf, that's my thing.
All right, cool.
I do
We
like
can still
mini
watch
golf.
the Masters.
That was a
Yes.
We can.
That was a
when the
huge
show is
part of
over,
my childhood.
When today is over, we can watch.
First, we got to talk about oil.
Let's talk about
Thank you,
oil.
Lisa.
All right.
Getting me back on task. Thank you.
Focus. Because oil is in focus, obviously, given everything that's happened and because of these peace talks falling apart overnight in Pakistan. And then yesterday, you had these two super oil tankers trying to cross the Strait and then made a U-turn as those talks failed and kind of headed back around. As the conflict drags on, traders are trying to gauge, is this volatility or is this the beginning of a true supply disruption?
And joining us now for more, market intelligence founder and director Amrita Sen. Amrita, I want to pick up where Christina left off, and that's what happens tonight when we see futures open and we see trading open. I guess, what would be your prediction, given the peace talks falling through or not succeeding to end the conflict, of where oil opens tonight?
I think oil is going to open quite sharply higher, in IG trading. If that's any guide over the weekend, it's already up 6%. What surprised me in this market is this consistent belief, I would say a lot of the macro traders have, that somehow there will be a resolution because the alternative is just too difficult to fathom, too difficult to kind of really think through and say, okay, what does this do to the global economy? I don't disagree with that, except that that's not the reason why the Strait is shut to begin with.
So we're in denial, essentially, about the ramifications of this?
Absolutely. And I think Christina said that, if this is a real supply disruption, it has been a real supply disruption pretty much since the end of February. Across March, 10 million barrels per day of upstream production was shut in. That's rising to 13 this month. The damage has been done already. We've drawn down all the oil on water that was floating from Russia, somewhat Iran as well. All the buffer that, people have been talking about, the oversupplied oil market, that has gone. Attacks on Saudi Arabia, the kingdom came out and also highlighted, yes, they fixed a lot of those attacks already. That just goes to show how strong Aramco is and the amount of buffers they've built up. But the fact that there have been attacks reduces the volume of spare capacity available to the market going forward as well. So this is the biggest energy shortfall in history. And the fact that, we're still talking about whether this is real or not, I think that's almost the problem we have, the discrepancy we are seeing in the futures market, like, what you and I see on the screen versus the physical price of crude oil. It's anywhere between $30 to $40 higher. And that's never happened before.
My other question is, this is not like, even if they'd come up with a deal in Islamabad overnight, it's not like this is a switch they can just turn back on, right? You've got to get those ships that are still 20,000 sailors and mariners stuck in the Gulf. You got to get them out. And then you have to be brave enough to get suppliers who are willing to go back in when a deal could potentially fall apart again. So Amrita, I'm wondering what the difference is between the Strait being, we've said this over and over again, nominally open and functionally open, and if that's going to impact price, if insurance rates, if what you have to pay people to be willing to crew these ships goes up, even if the Strait returns to a faster tempo, is that going to reflect in oil prices and futures as well?
I think you've literally hit the nail on the head. And that's why that's why I said at the start, right? I find it fascinating so many people are considering this to be binary. It's open or shut, but it's not. It's anything but binary, right? Like, first and foremost, like you said, the cost, right? The cost of getting a ship in. When the ceasefire first happened, we found out from certain sources that the quote that a ship owner was giving them for a ship to go in was $40 per barrel compared to $6 per barrel outside of the Strait, right? $40 per barrel, that's even before insurance. And imagine the cost of doing that. Basically, everything then just gets more expensive. And nobody wants to be the first one to get their vessels in. The vessels out, you could argue, slowly but surely they will get out if, whenever that is, we get some form of a ceasefire that holds, not the one that's right now where Iran clearly has complete leverage over the Strait right now, right? So it is going to be a very gradual process. There's the rumors about mines. I think that's going to make commercial shippers extremely anxious as well, because you don't want to necessarily take the risk. So I think there's a whole host of factors that we need to consider. Also, production takes time to bring back up. It could be months for certain countries like Iraq, certain fields in Kuwait. We've got satellite data, and we're very privileged to have that through Kairos, and we can see that actually tanks across the countries are not full. At best, you have 5 to 6 days of inventory cover. So let's say, best case scenario, you get 6 days worth of quote unquote flows. Then what happens? It'll still take weeks and months for production to come back. So then there'll again be a gap, right? So this whole normalization, even in the best case scenario, is months away.
Amrita, we're going to be speaking with former National Security Advisor under President Trump, former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, a little later in our program. And he said that the U.S. should blockade the Strait, allow no Iranian oil out at all until Gulf oil can transit safely as well. He also talks about military force being used to open the Strait. You're nodding. Is that where this goes? Is that ultimately what happens?
No, I'm nodding because I've heard what he said. Look, I mean, this is the most complicated picture right now, right? That the fact that the Strait wasn't secured is what has given Iran the biggest leverage it's had over 40 years. And our view going into the weekend, was the fact that, deal or not, in the sense that this is not going to get resolved in 2 weeks' time. It's going to take a lot longer. And we still are of the view that Iran is more likely to give in on some of their nuclear issues, given their nuclear capabilities have been heavily depleted, versus the Strait. The Strait is their leverage. So yes, look, I think there's been a lot of chatter in the market about how the US has allowed Iranian oil to flow. But I'll also say this has gone further because the US has also given waivers to allow Iranian oil that's floating to be bought by buyers. So, and that is money that's going back to the Iranians. I think this is fundamentally the issue, right? Yes, the US is the biggest producer in the world, and we are not expecting shortages outside of maybe the West Coast. But US policymakers have to appreciate this is a global market. And this kind of a blockade does mean high domestic prices. I think that's where the conflict is, so as to speak, within the US, right? If you don't want to allow oil prices to go up, that's why, things like Russian oil on water is being allowed, Iranian oil on water is being allowed, even Iranian ships are being allowed, because whatever you can flow to get quote unquote oil prices down is being okayed right now. And that's why we have this discrepancy.
I also want to ask about the possibility of a toll. The big fear from a lot of EU and global allies, and we were just talking with our White House correspondent Jeff Mason about this, is that the president, who keeps saying over and over again the U.S. doesn't need the Strait, which I think you can debate, will pull out of this conflict, which some sort of nominal deal, something that lets him save face, claim victory, and leave the Strait in a worse strait, pardon the phrasing, than it was before, and Iranians could functionally enact a toll. What would that do for oil prices globally? And is that something people in the industry are factoring in?
That is genuinely one of the worst case scenarios in terms of what could come out of this situation. There is no way we see the GCC agreeing to this. Look, ultimately, over the next few years, we will have alternative routes, right? New pipelines will get built, but these things take time. It's a huge region. It's going to take 5, maybe 10 years to normalize that. But the right here, right now, for the next 3 to 5 years will then just mean much higher oil prices as a steady state, right? Sure. And oil should be even higher today. Like I said, the physical price is at $150 and futures prices are about 100. So even if the futures prices catch up, what I'm talking about is, say, months from now, if that becomes the new reality, which again, I'm struggling with given the GCC is not going to agree to it. You just have to have a floor of maybe 80 to 90, even $90 to $100, because now you need to start taking those things into account as just the cost of doing business.
And that may not be a fight Iran really wants to pick, right? That's leverage that they're using, but do they really want to go up against Saudi, UAE, Qatar, Oman, all these exporting countries that would not be able to tolerate this?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, we had Eddie Fishman, the author of Choke Points, on last week, and he threw out a number that was pretty mind-boggling, $100 billion in revenue per year if they charge $2 million per ship.
Wow.
That's serious money. Listen, speaking of money, if we look at the futures curve for oil right now, going to December, $82 a barrel. In your view, does that accurately reflect what you think prices will be?
No, but this has been such an interesting and yet challenging market, including for traders, right? To trade this and for any policymaker or decision maker, CEO and otherwise, for the simple reason that the way futures works, right? We tend to trade a month and a half or 2 months further out, right? For Brent, we are now trading June, but we are in April. For WTI, we're trading May, but soon to be trading June. The problem we have is everybody is reflecting what is going on right now at the very prompt. That's why physical crude is trading at those crazy premiums. Further out, nobody knows exactly what the strait's going to look like, but people are not willing to deploy risk either to bid that up, because the general narrative still is the US doesn't want or will not allow high oil prices ahead of the midterm. The realities are very different, and what we continue to see is as those contracts become prompt, it just keeps rolling up, right? That's effectively been the trade. It's a roll-up trade, as we would call it. I don't think $82 further out. Sure, look, if we get a massive recession to balance this, that's a different situation. And I do think the risk of that is rising every single day. But in general, prices just need to be higher than that $82 going forward.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Amrita Sen, Market Intelligence founder and director. Amrita, always good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us. The politics angle that she brings up, we can't talk about that enough. And what this means here in the U.S. for midterms, if you're going to the pump and it's $4.30 a gallon.
It also just goes back to everything is so interconnected. You know, as someone who's followed policy, you know, you followed all this oil. We were just joking. I was saying this is a good long oil segment. And you said we never have enough time to talk about oil. But in this climate, it is relevant to absolutely everything we are talking about.
I mean, oil, fertilizer, refined products, jet fuel,
Midterms,
literally
yeah.
like pharmaceuticals.
Helium. And we were just talking about when it comes to elections anywhere, we always see those kitchen table issues take precedent, and this is what's going to hit everybody's bottom lines.
All right, I don't envy the position that politicians are in right now as they head to the midterms.
No,
specifically the Republican Party, who ran on affordability.
I think it's going to be tough.
Yeah, it is going to be tough. Hey, let's lighten things up a little bit, because in less than an hour, Rory McIlroy and Cameron Young will tee off at Augusta National in the final round of the Masters. We're going to take a look at the life of one of golf's greatest players. That's up next on Bloomberg This Weekend.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on some of the top stories. Well, the National Action Network convention in New York City came to a close yesterday with a number of speakers sharing the stage with Reverend Al Sharpton. Democratic Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona spoke about President Donald Trump's handling of the war in Iran.
What Donald Trump taught the Iranians is they now have a strategic asset that they can exploit for decades to our detriment. And then the other thing he accomplished, other than closing the Strait of Hormuz, is he alienated our allies.
And from the war in Iran to higher gas prices, well, they are turning the gig worker community upside down. The Wall Street Journal reporting drivers, food delivery workers, they are adjusting their schedules. They're turning down longer rides, and they're working more hours to make up for that lost income. And Rory McIlroy, he entered yesterday's round of the Masters with a lead nobody had ever had before. Well, he now enters the final round sharing the lead alongside Cameron Young at 11 under par. First tee time just after 9 a.m. local time in Augusta. McIlroy tees off around 2:30. And since golf is in the spotlight, well, a couple of days ago, I spoke with sports writer and author of the new biography on Rory McIlroy, Alan Shipnuck. Alan, appreciate you being here. Congrats on the new book. It's Rory, the Heartache and Triumph of Golf's Most Human Superstar. Now, the timing of this couldn't be better. We're deep into the Masters. Rory McIlroy, he didn't participate in the biography to say, I heard he wasn't the happiest at first when he first heard about it. What was his initial reaction? And then how did you move forward if you didn't have the buy-in?
Yeah, Rory is used to having total, dominion over his public image, and he knew he would have no such control over this book. And so that's unsettling for a guy in his position who calls all the shots. So we had a spicy conversation about this at the U.S. Open, but I was undeterred because I didn't really need Rory. I've had a lot of access to him throughout his career. He's had such a public life. And if you get really close to the subject of your biography, it sometimes can be hard to write it in a clear-eyed way. So that was fine. When Rory came to Pebble Beach earlier this season, I got him a couple copies of the book, and he started reading it, and he told me he liked it and made him laugh. So I'm in a good place with Rory, but that's not the audience I'm writing the book for. It's for golf fans. And so on a human level, it's nice that he's enjoying it, but that wasn't my primary consideration when I was typing.
Well, it's good that he liked it, though. That's a good thing for you. No, it's a great book. So you talk a lot about his career, like this existential crisis that he talks about with the game of golf. What's the concern there? What's been his concern over the past years?
it's really the burden of genius. You know, Rory was a child prodigy. He was like a little Mozart, and there's been expectations that have followed him his whole life. And for all that he's accomplished, it was never quite enough. And then he was on this very long quest to kind of fulfill his destiny and finally win the Masters. And you could see the toll that it took on him. And so part of the joy of watching Rory play golf is there's still a little, he has a little childlike wonder out there on the course. Like he's not an automaton. He's not a machine. Like he's, you can see his heart on his sleeve, and the good shots fire him up like it does the crowd, and the bad shots, you know, kind of take away his confidence and his mojo. And that was obviously on vivid display in the final round of last year's Masters, which was an incredible roller coaster. And that's why there was such an outpouring of emotion around that victory, is because people have been following Rory his whole career. You know, he grew up in the public spotlight, and there's a fragility there. There's a vulnerability which is rare in superstar athletes. And so we've suffered along with him through the years. And that's why it was so cathartic when he finally broke through and won the Masters.
All right, you mentioned the Masters, so I'm going to go there, Alan. Okay, so yes, he does have the green jacket, okay? But he's had a great start to the tournament this year. Do you think he could take it again?
Oh, yeah. When watching Rory early in the week during the practice rounds, I was convinced he was going to win because he was so jaunty. He was so carefree. And no one's ever had more fun being defending champ than Rory. He was just swanning around in the green jacket. He was presiding over all the ceremonies. And there's just a lightness of being that he's never had at this tournament. You know, he was always on a knife's edge when he showed up at Augusta. And so, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Rory wins 4 more Masters at this point. He's cracked the code on how to play the golf course. He's completely unburdened now, and he can just play free, and he can just attack the golf course, which he's, you know, certainly did to start this Masters. So whether he wins or not this year, he's going to be a threat for the next decade, and it's going to be fun to see how many more jackets he can win.
So you're saying he's just getting started?
No question. I mean, it seems like Rory's been around forever because he basically, you know, he dropped out of high school when he was 15, became a de facto touring, pro, playing all around the world. But he's only 36, and he takes great care of himself. Unlike a lot of his peers who are breaking down and having surgeries and all kinds of physical setbacks, he's been very healthy throughout his career. Like his longevity, he's been in the top 20 in the world ranking for 850 weeks. I mean, he's just always there, and I don't see that stopping. So yeah, I think a lot of his best golf is still in front of him.
Yeah, you mentioned his peers. One of them, Tiger Woods, who was really an influential part of his golf career, going through a tough time. Talk about their relationship, though, and can Rory be that person to help Tiger kind of come out of this?
Yeah, I mean, Rory, you know, he's always said Tiger was his hero, and then he became his friend and his mentor. And I think that the roles may shift here, because I think Rory's one of the few people on the planet who can, you know, speak truth to power to Tiger. You know, they're equals now. There's only 4 men on earth who have won the career Grand Slam. There are 2 of them. So, you know, Tiger has massive amount of respect for Rory. And unlike everyone else in the ecosystem around Tiger, Rory needs nothing from him. And so I think he can just tell Tiger the hard truths. And he has a lot of love and a lot of affection for Tiger. And I would love if Rory became that person, because Tiger's had a very lonely existence as a professional golfer. He doesn't have a lot of close friends. Some of the people that were in his life as friends became employees. And so that shifts the dynamic. And so it's an interesting twist in the relationship where, you know, the people may become the teacher, and Rory can guide Tiger through this very challenging time.
You talk a lot about Rory's family, too, in this. Now, Alan, you knew a lot about him, you know, the backstory of him, but was there anything that surprised you, you know, how he grew up or anything like that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's revelations on, you know, every chapter of this book for me, as even someone who was close to Rory. You know, when you do this kind of biography and you just embed into someone's life, you just learn so much. And it's really a feel-good story. I mean, Rory's parents sacrificed everything for him. You know, they were a very blue-collar family from this unglamorous, you know, little town outside of Belfast. You know, Rory grew up in the shadow of the Troubles. And it's a tale as old as time, parents kind of sacrificing for their children, but they're a very extreme example of it. And part of the reason that I think Rory is such a beloved figure, he's never forgotten where he came from. He's retained that humility. He does seem to have a wonder that, like, wow, I can't believe this is my life. And he's not jaded. He carries that gratitude with him. And his parents are a big reason why. I mean, it's a close knit family. They move in a pack, and they keep Rory's feet on the ground. So it's, just going deep on his childhood, going to visit this little town outside Belfast, getting to know the people around him. I think it brings an intimacy to the story. And like you said, some people, know the broad strokes, but to really bring it all to life in a kind of a rich portrait, that was really satisfying for me.
All right, Alan, best of luck to you on the book. Again, it's Rory, The Heartache and Triumph of Golf's Most Human Superstar. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
It's those strong family values that he's talking about that makes him just such a great, humble guy, too. But can he do it today again, guys? I don't know. There's only 4 people who've gotten that Grand Slam. So
wow,
we'll see. What
I also want to say this is really random and not helpful for our radio listeners, but that's a great book cover. It's just a solo shot of him, his full face, very minimal text, and it just says Rory at the bottom. Like, I would pick that up, and I wouldn't even know who that was off the bat.
Those cover jacket designers know what they're doing.
It's such a cool job. That's like one of those jobs that, Anyway, all right.
It's not too late. Said that twice today.
10 minutes too late. All right, coming up, why everything is more expensive and how the war in Iran is driving costs for Americans.
Hey, take us with you no matter where you go, no matter where you are. Listen on radio, stream us on the business app. We're there. It's Bloomberg this weekend.
We'll be right back. 2025 may have been the year of the road trip, but with the way things are shaping up, 2026 may be the year of the staycation, as budget seems to be on the world's mind due to conflicts in the Middle East and elsewhere. A lot of belt tightening and budget tightening going on. In fact, there's a new survey out from NerdWallet that shows that while a majority of Americans are looking to trim costs for a potential getaway, 42% would rather stay home than have to book a budget travel experience. Those are people after my own heart. To talk about this and just all the ways the economy is interconnected and it all kind of plays a part into what we're seeing right now, we've got Chief Investment Strategist at AlphaCoreWealth Advisors. That's David Stubss. Thank you so much for joining us. And you have a column this week in the New York Times kind of talking about all the different places we're likely to see this. And you talk a lot about tipping points and how we're nearly there in a couple of places. What are the ones that really stands out to you?
Absolutely. You're already seeing some impacts. And at the moment, I think the impact on the economy is fairly minor. The US economy is very strong. People can adapt. Gas prices have risen, but it's not really causing a material slowdown in the economy. The concern really is if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed for a long period of time, then the impacts start to compound on each other. So we've seen inflation be elevated across the world in the last couple of years. If there's a fear that inflation will again be elevated, some central banks may have to raise interest rates either to protect their inflation credibility or to protect their currency. And then thirdly, is the semiconductor supply complex. The semiconductor build out around artificial intelligence has been a huge driver of the economy and the stock market. Well, helium is an important part of that manufacturing process.
Right. We actually had a helium executive on the show, I think last weekend, talking about how critical that product is and how so much of it, I didn't realize, comes from Qatar, which cannot produce it at the same amount at the moment.
Yeah, it's absolutely, because helium is a byproduct of producing liquefied natural gas.
Yeah.
And obviously Qatar is one of the huge players in that.
You also talk about some of the points where this conflict and basically the oil prices could be impacting that I hadn't really thought of. Mortgage rates, also regional airlines. If you're trying to get to one of those smaller places, those are the flights that you're going to see cut first. Are there are there any other trickle down points that you think people aren't talking about or might not expect if this crisis continues?
Well, I think you hit on the way, firstly, that some companies have to adapt. I mean, the airlines, they cut the regional jets because those are the ones where the margins are lowest and fuel costs are a significant percentage of the price. So we may see some of those smaller locations have their flights cut. And then, of course, on top of that, the bond market has already reacted, right? You see higher bond yields across the world in terms of government bond yields. Mortgages are priced off those. So already you've seen a rise in, say, the 30-year fixed rate mortgage from where it was before the Iranian conflict. Now, this is not a huge deal at the moment, but again, it's probably unhelpful for a housing market that has been kind of stuck in the doldrums for a couple of years now. And I think it's very hard to unpick all the impacts across the economy and the world of basically pulling out one big chunk of the supply chain. And those impacts, they start to compound because once one industry has to make adjustments that affects people downstream, and that's why it tends to compound over time. And I think if we are able to see shipping transit through the Strait in the next couple of weeks, that will take some of the pressure off. The concern really is if it remains closed for a couple of months.
But it seems to me, I mean, in this, you say that no matter what happens, this is probably going to impact these prices through the end of the year, right? Because it's not like it's going to turn a switch and it's all going to be back on. These LNG networks, I was talking to some folks in Qatar earlier this week. They were telling me this is like a 2 or 3 year repair job. And just those pipelines they have to be rebuilt, even the ones that are, it's not as simple as just making the ships go through again. So where are we going to see the prices take the longest to recover, and what sectors do you think?
Yeah, I think you're very on the spot there. Absolutely. We've seen physical damage to the production facilities. There's also a lag where the raw materials, the raw energy and hydrocarbon may start to flow again, but actually processing it into things like gasoline will take a while. And then I think markets are going to look at this region and probably have an additional risk premium into anything coming out of it for the foreseeable future. We know that it's, even in the best case scenario, there's going to be a fragile truce there. So I do think that we'll see, it'll be a while before we get back to where we were before the conflict started. The question is, can we get to a place where the global economy can grow? Can we get to a place where the private sector is not disrupted? Can we get to a place where households are not materially impacted? I think we could if we saw a sustainable peace, but I think there would be a significant adjustment period to get back to where we were.
All right, quickly and selfishly before I let you go, I can't fly because I'm getting priced out. You said road trippers aren't going to have it much better. If I wanted to get a big RV and go to a national park, that's going to be too expensive. Say motorboaters could be up a creek too. All right, so what am I doing for vacation? What is my best bargain basement but still enjoyable vacation option, or should I just get some books and hunker down until prices reduce?
Well, I think reading some books is always fun. Exercise locally with your friends, I guess. But look, I think that you opened up the show talking about how people are reluctant to kind of go down market in their vacations. Ultimately, the travel part of the vacation is usually a small part of the cost. I'm not sure we'll see massive disruption there, but maybe it will take a little while for people to get back to the type of vacation that they want to take.
All right, David Stubss, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I mean, I do keep hoping one of these guys will give us some positive news.
Did you make those
so far,
summer plans yet?
No, I haven't made summer plans yet. I think I've missed the boat
She needs
quite
a
literally. I've missed the
vacation.
cruise ship. I've missed the plane. I've missed the train.
Sorry.
I just don't think it's happening. All right, as we're sitting here, we're seeing the president is up and active and seems to be sending out some messages on social media. We're going to get to that and a lot more. The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now. Coming up, no deal.
They have chosen not to accept our terms.
A day of intense peace talks between the U.S. and Iran ends without an agreement. We talked to President Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, about what's next.
And the Manhattan District Attorney is launching an investigation into California Congressman Eric Swalwell after a former staffer accused him of having sex with her without consent.
These allegations of sexual assault are flat false.
This morning, pressure grows for him to drop out of the race for governor.
Plus, the Treasury Secretary and Federal Reserve Chair convene bank executives to talk about Anthropic's new AI model. What's driving the cybersecurity fears? Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We are coming to you live from Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York. It is Sunday, April 12th. I'm Christina Ruffini.
And I'm Tim Stenevec in for David Gura. We are getting some breaking news. The president posting on his social media network that the U.S. will begin a blockade of ships to and from the Strait of Hormuz. Nuclear, he says, was not among the points agreed to. A very detailed post out on Truth Social just minutes ago. The president says that the U.S. will begin blockading ships trying to enter Hormuz and begin destroying mines that Iranians laid in the Strait. Christina, the president said, too, he's asked the Navy to to get in touch with every vessel that paid the Iran toll, and any Iranian who fires at the U.S. will be, quote, blown to hell.
That's right. And again, this is coming from the president, not CENTCOM or the Pentagon, but he says the blockade will begin shortly. Other countries will be involved. Iran will not be allowed to profit off this illegal act of extortion. He says they want money, and more importantly, they want nuclear. So we're going to continue to unpack this in a moment. We've got a team covering this, and we will speak to Ambassador John Bolton about this exact issue that he had been saying could be an outcome of where this conflict was going. First, we want to go to Lisa Mateo for the latest headlines.
And let's get to that absence of a peace deal. It's putting a fragile 2-week ceasefire at risk. Now, as for the responses to negotiations, well, yes, you just heard from President Trump. Vice President J.D. Vance, he claimed Iran declined to commit to not pursuing a nuclear weapon. Iran semi-official media, well, they cited excessive U.S. demands. The foreign ministry said it was natural that differences wouldn't be resolved in a single round of talks. And finally, Pakistan said that the talks were constructive and also called on both sides to maintain that ceasefire. Bitcoin, though, it dropped right after the news of that no deal. It's now down more than 2%. Oil and gas markets likely to see a jolt tomorrow morning. And in one of these first signs of the breakdown in talks affecting Hormuz, Bloomberg reporting that 2 empty supertankers made a last-minute U-turn as they tried to sail through the Strait. That was just as negotiations failed. Well, it's not clear why they turned back. It comes just after U.S. Central Command said 2 U.S. Navy ships transited the Strait and operated in the Arabian Gulf. Meanwhile, Israel continues to strike towns in southern Lebanon. Bloomberg reporting rocket fire from Lebanon continued to target Israel's northern communities, triggering sirens, sending residents to shelters. The Israel Defense Forces says it struck a rocket launcher in southern Lebanon, positioned and also ready to launch toward Israel. And in other news, all eyes are on Augusta National. In the final round of the Masters, Rory McIlroy entered yesterday's round of the Masters with a lead nobody has ever had before. He now enters the final round, sharing the lead alongside Cameron Young at 11 under par. The first tee time just getting underway. McIlroy, he tees off later this afternoon. And it was a hero's welcome for the 4-person Artemis crew after splashing down the Pacific Ocean Friday night. Their historic 10-day journey around the moon, well, it was a test flight. It'll actually lay the groundwork for future missions. NASA astronaut Christina Cook described what she saw from space.
So when we saw Tiny Earth, people asked our crew what impressions we had. And honestly, what struck me wasn't necessarily just Earth, it was all the blackness around it. Earth was just this lifeboat hanging undisturbingly in the universe.
NASA astronaut Reed Weissman said the crew is bonded forever. He got really emotional on stage. Another emotional moment, Christina, as Tim, is when they finally reconnected with their families, and that was like a really, really nice moment on the site as well.
A bit of nice perspective, as it looks like the Earth may look more united from space than it is on the ground, because we're hearing from the president this morning on Truth Social that the U.S. is going to create some sort of blockade through the Strait. Tim, you've got the headlines pulled up in the terminal here.
Yeah, the president says that the U.S. will begin blockading ships trying to enter Hormuz and begin destroying mines Iranians laid in the Strait. The president, too, asked the Navy to interdict every vessel that paid the Iran toll. And Christina, any Iranian who fires at the U.S. will be, quote, blown to hell. The blockade, he says, will begin shortly. And the president continues saying we are fully, quote, locked and loaded. The headline, though, the president says the U.S. will begin a blockade of ships to and from the Strait of Hormuz.
They've gotten 3 very lengthy posts in the last few minutes, and we're trying to go through them here. In order to help us do that, I want to bring in White House correspondent Jeff Mason, and our Mideast anchor Jemana Bersetchi is also on the line with us. Jeff, I know you're on the phone because we had told you you could stop being on TV today, but as you well know, having covered this administration for a while, that's almost never the case. I know we're all looking at these in real time, but the thing that strikes me is yet again, the U.S. has gone to negotiations, said they were serious, said they wanted to strike peace, and then almost immediately taken military action. What is your takeaway from what we're hearing from the president, and do you have any corresponding details from the White House yet this morning?
I think your takeaway is spot on, Christina, and I would also add just a couple of things that strike me. Number one, he said at the very end of his Truth Social post that the military will be ready, locked and loaded is his term, to finish what little is left of Iran. So that is leaving the military option on the table. But it's not what he led with. He led with this idea of a blockade. So I would interpret that to mean the next step in the U.S. action against Iran is going to be economic. He's trying to raise the economic pressure on Iran through this apparent blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, in order to force them into a deal, or in order to force them, again, to rethink their nuclear aspirations. I think it's certainly a sign of frustration by the president that they weren't able to come up with a deal. He's lashing out now, but he's lashing out with a plan that takes this entire effort into a different direction. He also hinted at other countries being involved in that, but doesn't say which countries they are. That would lead to questions of whether or not he's going to negotiate with Europe, or whether he's just going to increase pressure again on NATO to take part in a conflict that the United States and Israel started alone.
Jemana Bersetchi, come on in here from Dubai. A blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, an escalation certainly in that part of the world, and with regard to at least the way the economic elements of this are being thought about by the U.S. administration. What exactly does that look like, and what does that mean to you?
Yeah, well, in our previous hour when we were speaking to you, the suggestion that the Strait of Hormuz was going to stay closed for the foreseeable future was just not something that was going to go down well at all with the Gulf states. And in fact, between the last time I was on air and now, we've seen another comment come through from a very senior industry figure in the UAE. This is Sultan Al-Jaber. He's the CEO of ADNOC. And essentially what he was saying is that this Strait of Hormuz has never been Iran's to close or to restrict. Any attempt to do so is not a regional issue. It's a disruption of a global economic lifeline. And of course, just now in the last 10 minutes, we've seen that post come up from the president himself, suggesting a couple of things. I mean, these are long posts. He also talked about Iran and their nuclear ambitions. But let's just talk about the Strait for now. It clearly has emerged as one of the key points that the U.S. are absolutely resolved on opening. And the fact that the U.S. are now saying that they are going to impose the so-called blockade or blockade of ships to and from Hormuz is a significant step. As Jeff was saying, he's also implying that other countries are going to get involved in that as well, and also seem to suggest that there will be punishment for any vessels that accept to pay a transit fee, which is this new system, this new protocol that Iran has introduced over the course of the last couple of weeks. So this just tells you that there's been sort of a refocusing on the sequencing of how these talks need to go. And remember, one of the key conditions for the ceasefire was the unconditional opening of the Strait of Hormuz, to which afterwards, that same evening, the Iranian foreign minister put up a post saying, we will open the strait, but so long as ships coordinate with our own naval forces and our own armed forces. Again, not an outcome that is acceptable. And so here you're seeing that the U.S. are just taking it one step further. And again, with, as Jeff was saying, that hint potentially of military involvement as well in order to forcefully reopen the strait.
All right, Jemana Bersetchi and Jeff Mason, thank you both so much for coming back and being on that breaking news. We really appreciate you both. We want to turn now to former Ambassador John Bolton. Of course, he was the former national security advisor under President Trump during the first administration and U.S. ambassador to NATO. Ambassador Bolton, last time you were on the show, you were talking about how you had advocated for this at your time at NSC. you wish they would have done it then. You were glad they did it now. But in that intervening time, you voiced some concerns, both in writing and on some of the other networks, about how this is proceeding. I'm wondering, I mean, we wanted to get your take on these seemingly failed talks in Pakistan, but now I want to ask you what your thoughts on this blockade that's being announced by President Trump just minutes ago.
Right. Well, I come from the perspective that the only way to get true peace and security in the Middle East is to have regime change in Iran. You can negotiate all you want with these people. It's not going to change anything. And I think the failure of the Islamabad negotiations just makes the point as clearly as one can. I think the ceasefire was a mistake. But just dealing with where we are right now, part of the problem here was caused by Donald Trump a few weeks ago lifting American sanctions on the shipment of Iranian oil. And I think he was motivated by fear of rising international oil prices, and he thought a few tankers might get the price down. I don't think that's correct. I think it was insignificant. But what he was doing was allowing Iran to ship oil, not the Gulf Arabs, but Iran, presumably to get paid to gain resources to use in their military to kill Americans, financing the war against us. That never made any sense, and he should reimpose the sanctions. I think that may be. I haven't seen these tweets, but I think that may be what he's doing. And a blockade makes sense. You don't have to attack Karg Island. I don't think that was ever realistic. The point is, if no Gulf Arab oil gets out, no Iranian oil gets out. Let's see how they feel about that in Tehran.
We're going to get back to the blockade in a second, but you mentioned regime change. So I've got to ask you, this administration, the U.S. administration, seems to think that what has happened in Iran over the last 6 weeks constitutes as regime change. Do you agree?
That's ridiculous. Look, what we're dealing with is a group of religious fanatics pursuing a radical ideology, and it permeates the core of Ayatollahs at the top and certainly permeates the Revolutionary Guard. Now, the leadership of both the civilian side of the government and the Revolutionary Guard has been severely harmed by the last 6 weeks. Not enough, obviously, but it's beginning to fracture the regime at the top. There are signs of that inside Iran. And I think the devastation that's been unleashed against the instruments of Iranian state power, the Revolutionary Guard, the Quds Force, the besieged militia, are having a real effect inside Iran. I think the ceasefire was a mistake. The last thing you want to do is let up before you really do crack the regime and it collapses internally. That gives internal opponents and people who defect from the regime a chance to take over. Not guaranteed, but a chance.
Well, I think the challenge with that, Ambassador, some would point out, is there's not a clear group of those people. There's not clear opposition. There's not clear defectors. Who are the names? Who would be an acceptable leader of this country to you?
And are those moderates left? Because we've seen reports that many of them were potentially killed during some of these strikes. Yeah.
There were no moderates in the regime. If you judge by the most important criteria, who favors getting Iranian nuclear weapons, they all favor it. The opposition is really quite widespread across the country. It is disorganized, that's a fact, but it's not like Iran had a two-party system and we're saying, well, we want this party out and the other party in. I do think there will be a lot of turmoil. I think that's what happens after a 47-year-long dictatorship begins to collapse. And I don't think you can dictate who the leaders are going to be from the outside. But what we can say is if this regime begins to come apart, there are plenty of people inside who, seeing the ship going down, will decide they don't want to go down with it.
But Mr. Ambassador, what is the end goal here? Because, you know, we have your op-ed from earlier this week where you say the U.S. cannot leave without finishing the job. And we've been talking this morning, that was a fear of a lot of allies that the Trump administration, America, would leave with the Strait not fully reopened. It looks like they are taking action on that front. But even if they do, this regime has proven, I think, more durable than a lot of people in this current administration thought. I'm wondering if you thought they would outlast this long. And if they do start to crumble, to your point, there are no moderates in the country. What replaces them?
The people are the moderates. The regime itself is not a happy house for moderates. The Revolutionary Guard and the Ayatollahs have to be replaced. I don't think anybody can say with confidence that the regime has survived. You know, they've been building it for 47 years. We've attacked it for 6 weeks. A little patience is required here. The Gulf Arabs will tell you, I think, that they don't look forward to living as vassals to the Ayatollahs in Tehran. They want the Strait opened. And I think now is the time to do it militarily, because if we cannot show today that we can open the Strait, what happens 3 years from now when the Ayatollahs decide to close it again? If you want to live under that kind of regime, that is a guarantee of higher oil prices for a long time, and the Gulf Arabs being subordinate.
I also want to ask you, I watched the Trump administration pull out of the JCPOA the first time. The situation going into negotiations in Pakistan overnight, the elements on the ground were not that different than the agreement that the U.S. pulled out of. Do you think that was a smart decision to even go to those negotiations? Do you think it gave Iran a card it wouldn't have had if J.D. Vance hadn't touched down in Islamabad?
Well, I don't think the negotiations gave them a card. I think the ceasefire gave them a card. They'd been subjected to 6 weeks of constant bombardment. Now they've had at least some time to be able to regroup, to see if they can reconnect, establish communications. I think you need to put the pressure back on them. The immediate point is to open the Strait. If we open the Strait to Gulf Arab oil, but not to Iranian oil, that would be the ideal interim fix, I think.
On opening the Strait, and back to this idea of the blockade, which you have pushed for, in your New York Times op-ed, you write, if American combat forces entering the region can help open the Strait by controlling territory on Iran's side, acknowledging the inevitable risks, that would be more sensible strategically. Does this mean U.S. forces actually on the ground in Iran?
Yes, I said more strategic than taking Karg Island. Look, while we've watched for the past 10 or 15 years, Iran has been fortifying a number of islands in the Gulf. That's how they've set up this tolling system. Now, at least 3 of those islands are actually claimed by the United Arab Emirates, Abu Musa, Greater Tunba, and Lesser Tunba. They're filled with tunnels that probably have missiles and other equipment. I think those are the kinds of targets that we need to neutralize so that we can make the Strait safe for maritime transit. The military will have much more detailed knowledge of this, and I'm sure that's what they're thinking about now. It's not just clearing the mines from the Strait, although that's obviously important, but protecting convoys of tankers from anti-ship missiles, swarms of Iranian fast boats, of which we've sunk a great number, and Iranian drones dropping weapons from the sky.
You said we need to be patient with regime change, with change in Iran. But I'm wondering what that means. How long do you think this could take? How long do you think America should stay in this, considering this is a president who campaigned on no more forever wars? And do you think the president and the American public have the attention span for how long this could potentially take in order to see real, durable change?
Well, it's certainly the case the president promised no more wars. That's his problem. I mean, he apparently doesn't think too much of the pledge, because that's what he's doing now. And it is important to get the American public to understand why we're doing this, which is another problem of President Trump. He did not make what I think is the very compelling case for regime change before the war. He didn't try to persuade the American people. He didn't work with Congress. He didn't brief our allies. He didn't work with the Iranian opposition. It's still not too late, but a lot of the problems could have been alleviated. And you ask how long, I don't think you can put a time frame on it. I just want to introduce one radical concept, victory, that we actually defeat the regime, remove the threat of Iran's nuclear weapons program, remove the threat of international terrorism, remove the threat that's really almost as grave as those two, and that's Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz.
Ambassador, I understand that, but also you live in the real world. You've lived in Washington. We've got midterms coming up. We've been talking all morning about what this is doing for prices for the American public and how voters vote on kitchen table issues, and that's affordability. The longer this persists, the more we're going to see uncertainty in markets. Even if the Strait is open, it's not going to be open at the tempo that it was before, certainly not for some time. Aren't those two going to hit the road potentially before this job is accomplished? And do you think this administration, given what's coming in November, will wait it out? Or do you think they will cut and run before the job is done?
Well, consider the cost of not succeeding. That has cost, too. I think the president could make a very effective case that if you could get Gulf Arab oil coming out of the region again, Given that before this started, the world was awash with petroleum, people were talking about the surplus and what to do about it, I think prices would come down very quickly, especially when it looks like it is safe to bring maritime traffic through the Gulf. Simply the fact that the Gulf is open will cause prices to drop dramatically. So I think look, we should have done this 6 weeks ago. He should have seen this at the beginning. He said, I was surprised that they tried to close the Strait. I was surprised they attacked the Gulf Arab states. I can't imagine the Pentagon didn't warn him of these dangers beforehand. Maybe he just didn't pay attention.
The president in that True Social post at the top of the hour, just before the hour, said that nuclear was not among the points agreed to. We know that's certainly a sticking point for both parties when it comes to these discussions. It has been for years at this point. Ambassador, you're all too familiar with that. Is there a way for the U.S. to get this country to dismantle its nuclear enrichment program without changing the regime at the top?
No. I think that's the clear point. If you cannot change a regime's behavior and you don't want to live under an unacceptable threat like disappearing in a mushroom cloud, then the answer is change the regime. George W. Bush put it very, very well when he was president. He said, we cannot allow the world's most dangerous weapons to fall into the hands of the world's most dangerous people. And a lot of those most dangerous people are running the regime in Tehran.
All right, Ambassador John Bolton, thank you so much for joining us this morning and being back with us on Bloomberg this weekend. We want to bring in our reporter panel. We've got Axios National Security Editor Dave Lawler. Good timing, Dave. We're glad we've got you this morning. Jeff Mason is back with us, scrambled back in front of his camera. Jeff, we always appreciate you. And congressional reporter Alicia Diaz making her debut on the show on a very busy morning. Thank you all so much for joining us. Dave, I think I'm going to start with you. Do we know, have we heard anything from the Pentagon about what this blockade will entail? The president, when the True Social tweet says other countries are involved, do we know which ones? And more broadly, logistically, from a military standpoint, how do you execute something like this?
Yeah, look, President Trump has said for quite a while that, well, I will say he's flip-flopped on this point, but he's wanted to build an international coalition to open the Strait of Hormuz. A lot of European countries who could have brought some capabilities to bear were not willing to do that when there was a risk of coming under Iranian fire. That includes the French, the British. So as far as I understand, their positions have not changed. Some of the Gulf states, the UAE, for example, have suggested they would be willing to play some role in this, but they don't have the same level of naval assets to bring to bear in this coalition. So perhaps some support roles from some of those states as well as Israel. But yeah, President Trump has changed his position from we don't need to open the Strait to we'll have allies work with us to open the Strait to the allies won't do it, forget it, we'll leave and they'll take care of it, to now announcing, I guess, that the U.S. is going to play first and foremost a role in imposing a blockade and in figuring out what gets in and what gets out of the Strait.
Jeff, just let's take a step back here and try to parse through what exactly this means for the U.S.'s role in the region right now. Is this an escalation in a time where there's supposed to be a ceasefire to negotiate?
Yeah, I mean, it's an escalation of sorts. Yes, it's not an escalation of military might yet, although, as I said,
but the threats of it are there.
Exactly. The threats are still there, and that's how he concluded his most recent True Social post, and that's also how he went into the negotiations by saying if they didn't lead to a deal, then the shooting would start again. I think it's actually quite interesting that that's not what he led with here. Instead, he led with this blockade, creating more questions about how that's going to work, which countries are going to be involved. The spot-on question that Christina asked, which is how does the military even execute this? And then leaving the clear conclusion that the U.S. is not moving out of the region, but going to stay. So that's a long way of saying it's an escalation of sorts. And I tell you what, I think it'll be very interesting to see how markets react to this tomorrow, because the fact of any blockade, be it by the United States or other countries, preventing ships from going through the Strait, that has been the biggest economic ramification of this war. Has been the closing of that strait and the impact on oil prices, which President Trump desperately wants to bring down so that the gasoline prices are, in the United States anyway, are at a more palatable place come November.
Alicia, I want to bring you in because there is, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's a war powers resolution vote coming up on the Hill next week. Question we ask all lawmakers from all sides of the aisle every time we have on is, realistically, is there anything Congress can do to stop not only this president, but really any president that wants to take a military action like this? And can they even get on the same page to try?
It's a great question. And as we know, the president has no issue going around congressional authority. The war powers vote specifically will be largely symbolic. Even if it passes through the House and the Senate, the president has the power to veto it. However, Congress still holds the power of the purse. There's still a roughly $200 billion supplemental funding request for defense spending sort of looming in the background here. And so there are only so many creative budgetary moves that the White House can do before they will have to turn to Congress and say, we do need extra spending to put some might behind this conflict in the Middle East. And so it will be a stretch to see, can he get a sufficient number of members behind what is potentially an unpopular war.
Oh, I'm glad you said that, because this is exactly the needle that these members of Congress have to thread, especially those members who are up for re-election. Come November, how do they do this, or what are they doing in a way that shows that they support the president, or possibly if they start to push away from the president's position because this is unpopular, to try to win re-election, Alicia?
Exactly. I've talked to, election analysts and experts who say that it's possible we get to a point relatively soon where Republicans start to question, do I side with how my constituents are feeling, or do I continue to side with the president? What's going to be more beneficial for me? What is going to position me best to get up for re-election, especially with the midterms looming this November? So it is possible we start to see more of that fraying in what is already a very slim majority and kind of a disorganized Republican Party, especially in the House.
Dave, I want to go back to you and ask, first of all, if you've heard, just even in the last intervening minutes, anything from CENTCOM or the Pentagon, any details? I'm assuming the answer is no, but if I'm wrong, please correct me. I also want to ask, there's a ton of military equipment from the U.S. in the Middle East. Obviously, we tracked it for weeks as it was all heading over there. Do they have logistically the equipment they would need to execute something like this? And is the Pentagon, is the military getting a bit overstretched, because we had Venezuela, we have this, and now Trump is already talking about potential action in Cuba? At some point, does the rubber meet the road, and even a very loyal DOD is going to say, we have to pick some priorities because we can't be everywhere at once?
Sure. Yeah. The aircraft carrier, one of the two that's in the region, is setting records for the amount of time that crew has been on that ship. They were involved in the Venezuela operation. Now they're over in the Gulf. There's been some good reporting about just how stretched they are, that particular crew. You sort of extend that out to the full range of the forces that the U.S. is bringing to bear. Certainly, you could see the U.S., the troops themselves and the equipment being stretched. Some stuff needs repairs, needs to be rotated out, etc. Now, whether there's enough in the region to pull this off now, it depends exactly how they're going to execute this mission. There's been some doubt cast on the idea that the U.S. or even its allies have enough to be able to escort individual tankers in and out of the Strait. Now, that's not what Trump is saying here. He's talking about a blockade.
Right.
I'm trying to visualize even where you would position assets in order to impose a total blockade. Very, very difficult. It is a narrow stretch of water, but not narrow enough that unless the U.S. is willing to open fire on vessels that come through, which maybe we are, that you could interdict everything that's coming in and out of the Strait. But obviously, there has been some thought put into that on the Pentagon side. This has been one of the options that's been presented to Trump over the past several weeks. It's going to be a question of how they execute it and whether they then think, okay, we need to bring even more force to bear in the region, which will suggest to people sitting back in the U.S., to lawmakers, et cetera, that this is going to be a longer, costlier, potentially bloodier campaign, depending on what tactics exactly the military is using at a time when they were just sort of preparing the American people for this to be over, right? It was just a few days ago that Pete Hegseth said all of the military objectives had been achieved. President Trump himself was sort of talking in a tone that suggested he thought it was time to get out. And now, after just one day of talks, we could be back into a point where we're looking at an expanding U.S. operation in the Gulf. Now, I don't want to speak too soon. Those announcements were just made minutes before we all came on air.
Literally
right?
minutes ago. We'll give you some leeway there, Dave.
We're still making sense of it. But yeah, I mean, the signal could be that that the U.S. is stepping up, the operation in and around the Gulf rather than, 1 or 2 more weeks, as President Trump had said previously.
Jeff, I'm wondering if you know, and we may not know at this point, who we think got in the president's ear about this, because we talked previously, it seemed to me at least, that the president was kind of saying, well, the Strait could be open, the Strait could not be open. He'd almost lost interest in it, and now we get this about face and this very forceful tweet language and action from the White House. Do we think this is Vance coming back and giving him a call? Do we think this is someone else in his orbit pushing this? Who does this sound like to you as someone who covers this administration intimately?
Well, honestly, Christina, I think it's just reality getting into his ear. I mean, the fact that the Strait was an open question mark was a huge vulnerability for this president, for the United States, for the rest of the world. And it's a vulnerability that largely wasn't there before this war began. So even though he has used sort of positive language to say, oh, it'll just open up on its own, that was never realistic. And I think it also raises questions now. Again, there's so many questions that are being raised about what's realistic about this blockade. There weren't that many ships going through in the first place. Certainly the point of the blockade appears to be that he wants to prevent any ships going through that Iran had blessed. So that's going to impact Iran and up pressure on them economically, and also increase pressure on other countries that were supporting Iran. But I don't know the answer to who got into his ear. I think certainly it's he said that Vice President Vance and his other 2 envoys had briefed him. So I think they would be the last people who he must have been on the phone with. But in general, he had to address the Strait in some way. And this is how he's decided to address it.
The person who called was reality, as Jeff puts it so eloquently.
Hey, Alicia, we got to make a little bit of a pivot here, because you cover Congress, and we do have a member of Congress who's in the news right now, and that would be Eric Swalwell, who is facing pressure to step down from the governor's race in California, questions about his own future. An investigation opened here in New York about sexual assault allegations. Could you just bring us up to speed on what could happen to him and 3 other members of Congress that, now we're talking about could actually be expelled for various reasons?
Of course, it's definitely not, a great time in the California governor's race. Hakeem Jeffries already put out a statement, condemning the actions and the allegations, asking Swalwell to step down from the governor's race. To me, it seems like only a matter of time to not have the party leader on your side. It just seems like a grim chance of continuing in that race. And that really shakes things up. It's going to be interesting to see how California plays out. And of course, there's allegations amongst other members in both parties. And so, as the midterms continue to play out, it'll be interesting to see how this all goes.
All right, Alicia Diaz, our congressional reporter, Jeff Mason on the White House beat, and Dave Lawler joining us from Axios, their national security editor. Thank you all so much.
I go back to this idea of and look, this is a humanitarian crisis in terms of this war. People are dying on multiple fronts. Energy prices are going up. We look at this through many different lenses and many different angles, and one of those is what happens to oil, because oil affects so many people. It's a market that the entire world follows closely. Risk assets here in the United States and around the world. It's a weekend, so we don't have a good view into that.
We're waiting. It's Sunday.
We're waiting. It raises the question: what happens tonight when futures open? What happens, tomorrow when the cash market opens? To what extent is this an escalation, especially after last week's rally?
This is going to be really interesting, because we were talking prior to this about how even a full opening doesn't get that rebound right away. Does this help or hurt, quite frankly? Because to your point, what happens to the ceasefire? I think it's a wait and see, and we have to wait. We haven't heard yet how Iran's going to react to this.
Well, coming up, it could be the new era of cyber risk. Anthropic said that they will not release Mythos to the public because it's too powerful for bad actors to get their hands on. That's next on Bloomberg This Weekend.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. And President Trump busy on social media this morning after peace talks with Iran fell through. Among a number of things he talked about was how the U.S. Navy would begin a blockade of any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. And that post came after Vice President J.D. Vance said the two sides failed to reach an agreement during negotiations. And in other news, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office is opening an investigation into Representative Eric Swalwell of California. They're looking into a claim that Swalwell, who is running for governor, assaulted a woman in New York City in 2024. Swalwell is a Democrat who had been leading contender in the race to replace Governor Gavin Newsom. The news comes after the San Francisco Chronicle and CNN both reported on women who they said were victims. Swalwell denied the allegations on social media.
These allegations of sexual assault are flat false. They are absolutely false. They did not happen. They have never happened. And I will fight them with everything that I have.
Swalwell has not ended his campaign, but many prominent supporters are no longer backing his bid for governor. Well, Rory McIlroy's 6-shot lead has evaporated. He now enters the final round, sharing the top spot of the leaderboard alongside Cameron Young at 11 under par. McIlroy hits the course later this afternoon. And while temperatures in Augusta, they've been in the mid-80s for most of the tournament, a blast of hot weather actually sweeping into the eastern U.S. this week. According to the National Weather Service, Washington will hit the 90s on the National Mall on Wednesday, with New York Central Park set to reach the upper 80s on Wednesday, guys. So get ready for it. Yes. Okay. I know. It fluctuates. Break out the shorts.
Okay.
I'm not ready.
So-
I'm not mentally ready for shorts. Look at all this serious thing.
Sold.
I can't.
Sold. I'm
Oh,
sold. Yeah.
All right.
From
I'm sold.
California.
I forget that. All right. I like you anyway.
Big bank earnings coming this week. And in the backdrop is what happens with AI. Major banks across the country, including JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, they are testing out Anthropic's Mythos model internally for potential vulnerabilities. It does come after Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell summoned these bank CEOs for a meeting on cybersecurity.
That's right. We spoke with two of our own reporters, Catherine Doherty and Ryan Gallagher, about this meeting and other major cyber safety news.
So we've got Catherine Doherty. She's a Bloomberg News finance reporter. She's here with us on set. And Ryan Gallagher, he's also a Bloomberg News reporter, and he is joining us from hopefully sunny, but not usually Scotland, across the pond. Catherine, I want to start with you. So you've got some new reporting on Anthropic. What are the administration's biggest concerns here?
So the biggest concerns is this tech getting out of hand, so much so that the vulnerabilities that the tech is supposed to help with, these companies are rolling out this AI infrastructure to basically find the holes in their own systems.
And these are mostly financial companies?
And these are financial companies. So we've reported this week on the big bank CEOs that were all brought down. They were in D.C. already, but this last-minute meeting that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had arranged with these leaders of the banks. And it was really to discuss the seriousness of the situation.
Ryan, I feel like no one watched the very important 90s documentary Terminator. But is the fear here that the tech these companies are trying to use, can you explain how this works? Basically, they're jailbreaking themselves and then becoming a threat, or the fear is that there will be an AI-created virus that these companies won't be able to keep up with? All of the above? Explain to us a little bit what the concern is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of all of the above situation, but what the concern specifically here that Anthropic is raising is that they say they have developed this new model that they're calling Claude Mythos Preview. It's not been released to the public yet, but they're sharing it with a small group of partners. They're saying that this new model has been very effective at finding vulnerabilities in widely used software. So like just it could be a commonly used internet browser, could be your Windows operating system that they're talking about. And they're saying that this new AI model is finding vulnerabilities in these commonly used software programs that could be used for bad purposes, you know, that a criminal group or an adversarial nation state could get hold of and basically use to hack into computer systems and critical infrastructure and cause a lot of damage. So they're trying to get ahead of this and use this new model to find the vulnerabilities and fix them before the bad guys do. So it's a kind of an arms race, if you like, and they're trying to get ahead of that. That's what's going on now.
Catherine, what came out of this meeting? I mean, it's almost like they got summoned to the principal's office. Did they come up with any solutions or any way that they're going to try to address this?
That is step 2. Okay. I think right now, step 1, this meeting, precautionary. It's meant to get all of these executives from the banks that are all designated as systemically important. So this is the infrastructure of the U.S. financial system, which is why it is so serious, and it's being really summoned at a time to both get everyone on the same page and then start to plan for how to deal with this moving forward. But I think that the first meeting and the types of discussions that we have been hearing about from sources was really around what is the situation, and then it's how do we handle it, how do we deal with it, and how do we keep our consumers in mind, because at the end of the day, that is what's always top of mind. It's the safety and soundness of the U.S. financial system.
Right, because if consumers can't trust what's going on at their banks, they're not going to invest with them. Ryan, and speaking of consumers, I understand if we weren't worried enough, I also need to be slightly afraid of my router. Can you please explain to me what's going on there?
Yeah, this was just some other recent news in the last few days that the British and American law enforcement agencies discovered an operation by the Russian government to break into commonly used internet routers that are manufactured by companies such as TP-Link, which is a big Chinese manufacturer of routers that are commonly used everywhere. And they're saying that a Russian intelligence agency figured out a way to essentially manipulate the routers so that they were sending people's internet traffic through infrastructure that the Russian intelligence agency controlled, and they were stealing people's passwords, stealing data, using that essentially to spy on governments and corporations to steal information. So this was quite a big deal in the last few days, and they're trying to advise people against using certain routers that are particularly vulnerable to that attack, which actually happen to be older variants. So if you have a newer version, it might not be vulnerable to that particular attack.
My router is very old, so I'm going to go home and check this because I am cheap and don't like to replace technology. The NSA is warning that if you think you've been targeted by Russian hackers, you should contact your local FBI office. How do I know if I've been targeted by Russian hackers? And then what should I do? If I have the old one, you're supposed to reset the router?
That's right. Well, they actually did helpfully put out a list of the specific models of the router that are vulnerable to this, so that in the first instance, if you have one of those, you can find that information online. And if you have one of those particular routers, I would say bin it and get a new one. But the FBI actually in the United States, they said they detected these attacks going on in like 23 different states. So it's quite a big deal. And the FBI figured out quite a smart way to, they somehow are able to remotely reset and combat this attack on people's routers themselves. They've said they've done that in some cases. So they're actually, the FBI is going in and sort of shutting out the hackers. So that's helpful. But yeah, if you have one of these routers that have been identified as vulnerable, it's definitely a good idea to get rid of it.
All right, I will go on Google and see if I am vulnerable. Ryan Gallagher, Catherine Doherty, thank you both so much for joining us on The Weekend. All right, thank you to our team there. We want to go back now to breaking news. The president going on social media, True Social, just a little while ago to announce that following those failed negotiations in Pakistan with the vice president and Iranian officials, the president says the U.S. will begin a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. He says the U.S. will also start destroying mines in that strait. Now, remember, we had a UN official on the show yesterday who said he was unable to confirm reporting that those mines were throughout the strait or they weren't able to locate them. But big news. And Tim, you posed the question, what does this mean for the very fragile ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran?
Yeah, I was going to say, reminder, we are in a ceasefire right now. This does come after negotiations I don't want to say fail at this point, but J.D. Vance is going home from Pakistan empty-handed. The president, we have no idea.
The ball didn't move. The ball didn't move.
The ball didn't move.
Two sides left with
the same way they came in.
And I think, in fact, one could easily argue that this represents an escalation, at least during this time of a fragile ceasefire.
We are waiting to hear reaction from the region and from Iran, but I would wager to say we will get some strong pushback from that at some point today.
Let's bring in Bloomberg Intelligence senior commodity strategist Mike McGlone, who watches the oil markets as part of his remit for Bloomberg Intelligence. Mike, I just want to get your reaction to escalation like this in the Strait of Hormuz, an area responsible for about a fifth of the world's oil. What does this do to oil prices?
Yeah, well, you know the answer to that, Tim. It's a question of how high they go when we open up Monday morning or open up actually tonight. But you're already seeing the indication of wealth reversion or destruction in Bitcoin. It's down 3%. It's the only really active market that's trading it right now, risk assets. So I think what we're seeing right now is we're going to probably see a decent amount of crude oil rally, energy prices rally on Sunday night, Monday, and a decent amount of decline in the stock market. The question is how much. So, and how this is resolved. But just the fact that, there's still aggression there from Iran, the fact that we've not been able to open and secure that strait, maybe this will help make it happen. But that's the big unknown. And that's the key thing about markets, an unknown. And the key thing to think about here is the stock market got back to unchanged on the week on the year on Friday. This might have been that sell signal.
Mike, we've also got Lisa Mateo here with us at the table, and I know she's got many questions for you. So go ahead, Lisa.
Mike, I wanted to ask, because there's so many different benchmarks, like, for example, the difference between Brent and WTI crude. Can you talk about how they're behaving differently and how they have been?
Historically, Brent or WTI is a better grade. Historically, it traded at a higher price. But that changed in 2011 or 12, so when the U.S. supply started to be excessive, and then it traded at a lower price. Now what we have is the rest of the world demand pull on U.S. exports, because we're a net export of crude oil, liquid fuels. If you include Canada, it's around 8 million barrels a day. But there is a key sore thumb I'm worried about. We have a president who started this war and has a big problem with inflation and prices going higher. To me, the risk is he might ban exports, which to pressure U.S. prices lower, but not care about the rest of the world. So that's the key thing that's happening right now. We're bidding up WTI. I think the risk is there might be one decision to limit the ability for U.S. oil prices to go higher, because we're absolutely a net exporter.
I mean, that's what's been surprising on an economic level about the president taking on this conflict right now, because to your point, he is obsessed with inflation. He is obsessed with wanting to say prices are going down. Do you think you will see this other places, this shock throughout the different places throughout the economy? What do you think this is going to do for inflation? Because one of the things we've been talking about is even if it's open a little bit, the Strait is not open fully. Production is not springing back to where it was. What is the tail end of this, and where do you think you're going to see it impact?
Well, it's still early days. It reminds me a lot. There's a big combination here of 9/11, when we had that major shock. It was a psychological shock in the attack, and 2008, when we had that big pump in energy prices. And one thing to remember is the risk is post-inflation deflation. Now, we're in inflation right now, but the thing is, when you have a global energy crisis and crude oil spikes, it's its own worst enemy. It only goes up so far. Supply comes on, demand collapses, and the whole economy goes down. So the key thing for me now is if we're seeing demand destruction. It's early days. You certainly see that in prices of diesel. The price of diesel in this country has shot up, and of course in the rest of the world. But typically that'll shut down the demand, and it can really adjust people's capital decision making. And to me, the key trigger is consumer sentiment. We see Mr. Trump the lowest in his polls, with some people said since when Mr. Nixon, right before the impeachment. So he has nothing to lose. But I think this is one of those things. This is really bad as we head towards the midterms. This is really bad for the consumer. And the key question is, what's our president going to do about it?
Well, what can the president actually do about it? If he does ban exports, does that actually make a dent? Because my understanding, Mike, and you know this better than anyone else, is the oil that the U.S. produces is a different type of oil that's not necessarily refined by our refineries that we have throughout the country that actually get that refined product to us.
That's the key theme, Tim. You nailed it. There's a major difference between the actual price of that crude oil and refined products. They're a different market, and a lot of that's imported in the U.S. But the bottom line is, before, used to be no refineries in your backyard. I guess we'll have to shift that. It's the key fact is drastic measures and really low, getting your back up against the wall usually means certain significant decisions. So I don't know where it's going to go. The key theme is this was probably supposed to be mopped up in a week, meaning we were supposed to be able to say that the Strait would be cleared, and it's not. So the question is, what are they going to do next?
The next question we have is the Strait of Hormuz, right? That's what we've been talking about. Is there anything else that we should be concerned about or worried about that we're not talking about?
Well, the thing is, it's the human ability when there's necessity for invention. Now, we're hearing a lot of workarounds. For instance, Saudi Arabia has had a pipeline going to the Red Sea. There's been talk about the China-Iranian railway. I'm sure they can get oil through China from Iran to China that way. But this is the fog of the war. I assume 5 years from now, we're going to look back and the Strait won't be as significant. We'll find the workaround like we did in 2022. It just accelerated that trend of technology replacing fossil fuels. But right now, the bottom line, Mr. Trump, I think his advisors tell Mr. Trump, there's one thing you need to do here. You got to open that strait, whatever it takes. And maybe this is the next step.
Speaking of the president, he's been very bullish and optimistic that the U.S. action in Venezuela is going to really pump some energy, no pun intended, into that oil sector. But to Tim's point, this is a different kind of oil. It's very heavy. It's hard to refine. And that oil sector is really, really degraded, needs a lot of repairs. I've seen that's on like a 7-year timeline. Is there any possibility that Venezuela can get online fast enough to make a dent in some of these prices that we're seeing? Or is the president not quite accurate on that?
I think it's more the latter. We know his bravado. I mean, it's going to go there. And when people say long-term, that's a key thing about commodities. The elasticity of commodities is a complete bull market. But the thing is, this Venezuelan issue really marked the bottom in crude oil, around $55 a barrel. And obviously now we're pushing on 100 in that fund contract. That's a long-term thing. But and the point is, on the big picture, that's part of that shift in the world from the Middle East, and the Strait doesn't matter as much for the U.S. The price maker status in crude oil has shifted to the Western Hemisphere, from Canada to Argentina, U.S. in the middle, U.S. the most significant part about it. And who's leading this war? U.S. So I'm just thinking whether the next iterations, the key thing I'm worried about as we hit in the market now is we've never seen this kind of volatility in crude oil and gold without it trickling out to the stock market. And the stock market got back to unchanged on Friday. I think this might bring out pretty significant sell tickets, and I'm really worried about that.
Hey, we want to talk about Bitcoin, but just before we do that, 30 seconds, Mike, because you lived through the global financial crisis, watching oil closely. You understand the patterns and what this does to economies. What would be your call about a price of oil being linked to a recession in the U.S. in the next few months?
Exactly. I do think by the end of the year, crude oil, that December contract, more likely to go to 50 than 100. Right now, it's about 73. Okay. And that's part of the stock market dropping 10, 20%.
Wow. Okay. At first, I was excited to hear that, and then not so much.
Not so much.
Take it away.
Well, I'm looking at my screen here, Mike, and I'm seeing Bitcoin down about 3%, just above 70,000 right now. I mean, did that surprise you? I mean, usually something like this, Bitcoin, wouldn't it make some big moves?
It's a highly volatile risk asset. It trades on weekend. It's the only thing people can buy or sell. And it's in a bear market. And it's near the upper end of the range. I think that's part of Bitcoin dropping down to at least 50 this year. And I don't see why it shouldn't go lower. The thing is about Bitcoin, it got way too high last year. And now there's an unlimited supply of similar cryptocurrency. So that's a bubble that's still bursting.
Mike, I got one more short one before we let you go. I've been curious about safe havens and what safe havens are left. Gold, obviously, one of the go-tos, but has not been performing quite as well or the way one would expect. Talk us through it, where we're at and what you do.
So I love being part of, I can't make trade recommendations and stuff, but compliance has never said I can't overweight treasuries. And to me, that's where we're supposed to be. Overweight treasuries. Hide from the market. If you're not long energy, it's not the time, because energy goes up and then it makes it go back down. The key theme to remember here, though, is gold warned us. This was prescient. Last year was the best year for gold since 1979. Now it makes sense. But at the end of February, it was the most expensive ever versus the Bloomberg Commodity Index. It was near a 50-year high versus a basket of treasuries, and a 50-year high versus a 60-month moving average around there. I don't think I'll ever be able to say that again. Gold is now a highly volatile risk asset, and when stock market goes down, gold's more likely to go down.
That is crazy to me. All right.
Mike McGlone has spoken.
Yes.
I'm taking it as written. Mike McGlone, thank you so much for joining us. Really, thank you everybody who scrambled this morning to help us get on air and cover this breaking news.
Yeah, really appreciate the entire team, not just you guys for letting me fill in for David Gura, but also the entire team behind the scenes who makes this happen and scrambled to get the right voices for this program.
And thanks for hanging out with us, Tim.
Hey, I've got great news for you.
You can sleep tomorrow.
Well, I was going to say David Gura is going to be back next week. The whole time. Can't wait. I miss David.
We all miss David, Tim. We miss David so much.
Who doesn't?
All right. Thank you for coming in. Thank you for joining us on Bloomberg this weekend. Straight ahead, Wall Street Week. If you're watching us on TV, I'm Christina Ruffini with Tim Stenovic and Lisa Mateo. Have a great Sunday.